Chapter 971. Bang! A loud and clear sound rang out. An extremely deep crack appeared on the boulder under Su Li's feet. The crack exploded in the middle, followed by a barrage of bullets. Not far away, a large tree was hit. The trunk swayed, branches and leaves fell, and the sharp white pieces of rock that were hit flew in all directions. The most dangerous bullet hit the top of the boulder, less than 30 centimeters away from the tip of his foot. Even though he was wearing thick military boots, he still felt his calf go numb from the impact. At this time, Su Li suddenly felt a tingling numbness in his mind. He was so far away, yet he was still almost hit. He was startled and subconsciously took 2 steps back nervously. His originally continuous and extremely rhythmic shooting was suddenly interrupted. The optical targeting device was aimed at the space between the 2 giant mechanical legs of the military vehicle on the highway. It vaguely captured the image of the general firing the gun. He instantly remembered that after Mr. Shi's death, the ACW had been left in the Iron 7th Division. Now, it was naturally in Du Xiaoqing's hands. Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and returned to his original position. He leveled the ACW and continued to shoot at the road below. There was no extra emotion on his face, only a sense of valiance hidden behind the calmness. Takashi Aoki, who was behind the boulder under his feet, was continuously hit by bullets. He didn't even blink as he steadily maintained his shooting posture and continuously pulled the trigger. This was the shooting of ACW against ACW, a battle of will against will. Schiller once said, "Some people, even if they have a divine gun in hand, will never become the god of guns." The ACW was no doubt a divine gun. These 2 were the only long-range divine guns left in the Federation, and they fell into the hands of 2 extremely determined and calm men. Today they met on the mountain road and began to blossom. Presumably, they didn't feel like they were covered in dust, in the darkness before dawn. Su Li arrived at the mountain opposite the Iron 7th Division's base. He lowered his body temperature and slowed his heartbeat, waiting silently like a rock. Then he would wake up because of the gunshots and because he was shot. His day began in such a violent manner, and it was destined to leave behind many unforgettable scenes in his life. Perhaps the human brain had some sort of ability to foresee this kind of fate, so at the beginning of the day, when he stood on the cliff and shot at Du Xiaoqing on the road at the foot of the mountain, Su Li thought of many people in the past, and the words those people once said. When he pulled the trigger, he thought of Schiller's famous words. When he reloaded, he thought of the conversation he had with Commander Zhong in the West Woods' Red Chili Oil restaurant. The Tiger of the West Woods thought that Du Xiaoqing was very dangerous because of his calm fanaticism, and because he had expressed a certain attitude in the first military academy. The Federation needed a stronger government to truly defeat the Federation. It was because of this judgment that he had suppressed Du Xiaoqing for an entire 10 years. Su Li knew that Du Xiaoqing was very dangerous because he was no longer the commander of the Iron 7th Division, but the most unshakable existence in the federal military. He was a godlike figure deeply loved by the people of the Federation. If this person was allowed to lead the Iron 7th Division into the capital, no one knew what would happen, so he wanted to kill him. At the very least, no one knew what Du Xiaoqing was thinking about that day. When this famous Federation general indifferently ignored the danger and fired at the mountaintop like an ordinary soldier, what did he think of Su Li? What reason did he have to continue on this faintly tragic path? Where did his cold desire to kill Su Li come from? Du Xiaoqing pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mound under the rock, exploding into a clump of yellow earth. Su Li pulled the trigger. A bullet fiercely shot into the mechanical leg on the road, producing a crisp sound. At this moment, the 2 people on the mountaintop in the road, no matter who killed who, would be able to quickly return this suffocating world to its normal path. However, because the distance was too great, the bullets fired from the 2 thick ACW barrels made the world change color. Loud bangs rang out, but they were unable to accurately kill each other. It sounded more like 2 silent blacksmiths continuously hammering iron. However, even if they were hammering iron, the next hammer might be able to break the iron plate. In that case, No one could guarantee that the next bullet fired from the barrel would hit the other's body first. Amidst the flying shards of sharp rocks, the crisp bangs of bullets, and the dense shockwave of bullets, Su Lo and Du Xiaoqing coldly looked at each other from several kilometers away, unmoving like mountains. At this moment, this extremely rare exchange of long-range sniping had nothing to do with the quality and accuracy of the guns. The only thing left was luck. The two of them were gambling with their most valiant willpower and determination. They were gambling with each other's lives. On a mountain road, 170 kilometers to the south, two men were silently shooting at each other from long range. In the western suburbs of the capital, on the balcony behind Macho Mountain, Lady Tai and President Pabre were still on the phone. Terminating the military supply contract and blowing up the crystal mine is using the lives of millions of innocent soldiers on the front lines to threaten the Federation. Do you not have a single bottom line? What exactly do you want to do? Lady Tai indifferently listened to the president's low and sharp reprimand. She replied, "Mr. President, keeping a promise is the most basic of morals. It is the bottom line of human interaction. The Crystal Mine Consortium and nutshell were the conditions given to us by the entire society when we gave up the imperial power. If the Federation had kept the promise from back then, the shares of the 3,000 families would not have surfaced. If the government did not have any ideas about the Crystal Mine Consortium, the crystal mine would naturally be safe. The problem now is that you and your government have treated my family crudely. You have underestimated the Tai family and forgotten what this noble family name represents. This family has ruled humanity for tens of thousands of years, and the other 6 families were the retainers of the Tai family. Therefore, the Tai family has the responsibility and obligation to protect their existence, except for the Zhong family in the West Woods. Because the Zhong family was the first to betray the dynasty, they surrendered to the Republican forces in exchange for military power, and they have always thought that the East Woods incident was a purge planned by the Tai family and the Union Gang, but they have never reflected on it. That is because their shameless surrender made those so-called democratic sages realize that these families are not as unshakable as they thought. Mr. President, I will not make the same mistake as the ancestors of the Zhong family. I will not surrender, so I can tell you clearly that these families may be destroyed because of internal reasons, but they will definitely not fall because of external pressure. President Pabre on the other side of the phone was silent for a moment before he asked, "What exactly do you want?" "I want you to step down," Lady Tai replied concisely. "That's an impossible thing." President Pabre replied in a deep voice. "The situation has developed to this point. Even if you have a trump card that can shake the Federation, it is impossible to turn back the tide of history. I want to remind you, madam, that Tai Ziyuan has already promised to donate the Crystal Mine Consortium. The shares of Nutshell are exposed to the public. Even if you families force me to step down or even kill me, do you think that the Federation will still be controlled by the 7 families in the future? Our trump card has never been completely explained by anyone, including you." Lady Tai walked to the railing with the phone in her hand. She looked at the thin ice on the surface of the lake and said expressionlessly, "Without the crystal mine and nutshell, do you think that the Tai family will not be able to survive in the Federation? I can remind you of one point, including the President's residence in Parliament Hill. These lands are all mine." She did not give the other side of the phone the time to digest the shock and said, "A Yuan once trusted and admired you a lot, but you do not know that under that thin body hides a magma-like fury and a terrifying learning ability. When he discovered that you had betrayed the ideals he believed in, the combination of the two was so powerful. All of the families have been silent for an entire 3 years. That is because I know that if the government, and you were willing to abide by the rules, a Yuan definitely has the ability to defeat you. But since the Federation government is not going to abide by the rules and tear away the cover of the law, then do not blame us old fellows for taking action. I have to admit that your trump card and strength have indeed caused the Federation to be greatly threatened. But madam, have you not thought about how the current situation will end if the government is not willing to compromise? At that time, you should be very clear about what kind of reaction the federal forces will have. Mr. President, if you start to go crazy, if Lee Jae-do starts to go crazy, if most of the people in the government start to go crazy, then I will have no choice but to become a crazy woman. Lady Tai held the railing with her left hand and the phone with her right hand. She said in a deep voice, "Even if we die together, so what? Our descendants will continue to live, and you and your government will gradually be eroded in these ruins, and then become an insignificant line on the pillar of shame in history." Her voice suddenly became cold, and with an extremely rare sharp and cold tone, she said sternly, "If you dare to let Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division take one step into the capital, then we will all be destroyed together. If you want to destroy the Tai family, then you must take the Federation down with you. Mr. Pabre, from 3 years ago, I knew that you couldn't win this war, because you weren't clear-headed at all. You didn't know that you were actually fighting against the entire world alone, against a great history that you didn't know how great." On the other end of the phone, President Pabre was silent for a long time, and then his tired voice became stable and tough again. He slowly replied, "Madam, if this is your last condition, then let us and this rotten world be destroyed together." After the call ended, Lady Tai stood by the railing of the balcony, looking at the quiet lake in the forest in winter, and was silent for a long time. Secretary Shun, who was standing behind her, had a nervous expression because of the president's last sentence. "In your opinion, is Du Xiaoqing crazy?" Lady Tai suddenly asked. Secretary Shun shook his head. "Very good. Pabre has already started to regret, but let's see how long he can hold on." Lady Tai lightly touched the cold stone railing, as if she was describing the old general on the chessboard, who was full of vicissitudes of life, hiding in the soldiers, and never waking up again. Chapter 972. There was an old proverb in the Federation, which was called passing on the torch. Because too much time had passed, most of the people didn't know the meaning of these 4 words. But for the people of the big families, they knew very well that these 4 words represented the reason why the family could survive for thousands of generations, and represented the endless desire to live and multiply. In the past years, no matter how heavy a blow the 7 families suffered in the war with the rulers, and how much their strength suffered the most extreme damage, as long as the bloodline still existed, and the best of the descendants lived on, then there would be a day when they would be able to repeat their glory. In the apartment building that had been turned into a silent military headquarters, the fully armed Black Hawk Security Company manager Shui, he looked at Taizian in front of him and said, "Young master, look outside. I brought 400 of the most elite subordinates here, and the goal is to take you away, not to be persuaded by you to watch this civil rights movement. I don't need to persuade you." Tai Ziyuan gently covered his mouth with a white silk handkerchief, looked at the solemn family forces outside the apartment building, and said with a smile, "The truth is that I don't want to leave, and you know very well that if I don't want to leave, you can't make me leave." "Young master," Shui anxiously said, "we are not the Li family nor the Nan family. The Tai family only has you, and now that the government has shed all pretense of cordiality, Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division will enter the capital soon. If something happens to you, the Tai family will be finished." Tai Ziyuan slowly put down the white silk handkerchief, pointed at the busy staff in the hall behind him, and said seriously, "The results of Parliament Hill will be out soon. 100,000 no. Now more than 300,000 people are waiting in the streets of the capital for the final victory, or the shadow of death. And these are all my responsibilities. How can I leave at this time?" "Responsibilities? Then what about your responsibilities to the family?" Shui looked at him with disappointment. "I don't think I have the obligation to take responsibility for the family." After a moment of silence, Taizian gently patted Shui Yi's shoulder and gently replied, "Shui Yi, in my world, there is no concept of master and servant. Whether it is you, my mother, or that old man from the Li family who has already passed away. In fact, you have never understood what my true thoughts are." The young senator walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the sea of people that had already filled the streets not far away. He looked at the men, women, and children who were waving flags without knowing that danger was approaching. He said calmly, "In the battle against President Pabre, I more or less borrowed the strength of my family, but my purpose is still not the survival and glory of the 7 great families. My purpose is very simple. Whoever violates the charter and the laws of the Federation should pay the price. Tai Ziyuan turned around, pointed his right index finger at his pale face, and said with a smile, I'm really moved. Until today, I believe that whether it's Su Lu, President Pabre, or you, none of you are willing to believe that I'm different from the elders of the family. I'm a newbie, a complete newbie. Don't try to knock me out and take me away. Otherwise, whether it's you or my mother, none of you can bear the possible consequences when I wake up. After saying this, Tai Ziyuan no longer continued to look at Shui Yi and those confused family members. He silently walked back to the command center hall, looked at the finance department manager, who was still in a state of shock, and said with a smile, I didn't expect that in my magnificent legacy, there would be a part of the Nutshell Mobile. Please calculate with your colleagues in the finance department when you are free. If all the people of the Federation want to buy 11% of the shares of the Nutshell Mobile, how much would it cost per person on average? Shui slowly put down the heavy standard machine in his hand and looked at the thin back of the desk in the distance with a complicated expression. As a core member of the Tai family for generations, for the first time, he was shaken by the concept of the so-called family of thousands of generations. Could it be that these things were really very boring like what the young master said? The homeland of the Federation was already in a precarious situation. Once this war really started, then no matter who won or lost, it would inevitably lead to the most tragic and terrifying ending. However, it seemed that the Creator wanted the people of the Federation to experience more tests, and wanted the people of the Federation to know what was the true meaning of internal and external troubles. Therefore, more stories happened in the Zhuotian galaxy, which was far away from their homeland. Your Highness, the Crown Prince is now lost in the Federation, and the young princess is also staging an uprising in the West Woods. If we launch such a large-scale attack on the Federation's war zone at this time, I am very worried that their situation will become more dangerous. The Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Military Affairs who received His Majesty's order looked at Huai Chaoshi, who was walking out of the camp in fear. His body was extremely low, and his voice was constantly trembling. It is his own choice to risk his life for those outlanders. Since that is the case, he must bear the consequences of this choice. Huai Chaoshi did not turn around. Her voice was abnormally calm. The Empire will not give up such a good opportunity in front of us, just because of his life and death. The invasion force of the Federation is currently in a state of panic. Logistical support is rare and inefficient. If we lose this opportunity, have you ever thought about how many soldiers will die because of this when we want to take back planet Emohua and chase the invaders out of the Zhuotian galaxy in the future? Huai Chaoshi narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at the hundreds of Empire fighter jets whistling through the sky. She looked at the densely packed wolf Fang mechas in the wilderness. She looked at the equipped military vehicles passing through the simple roads. She looked at the ordinary soldiers of the Empire, who were holding guns and silent and uneasy. She said expressionlessly, I am an older sister, but I am first and foremost the Empire's princess. I am the highest commander of the Empire's frontline troops. I have to be responsible for these fresh faces living in front of me. After saying this invincible princess took off her black military cloak and threw it to Paul behind her. She then jumped onto the tall peach miasma mecha. Before Du Shaoqing left the Zhuotian galaxy, he had left her an extremely valuable gift. The Federal forces had obtained 2 great victories in planet Emohua Straits War Zone and the Southwest War Zone. All military analysts firmly believed that the Empire's ground forces, which had suffered heavy casualties and lacked the protection of a fleet, would not be able to carry out a large-scale attack for at least 2 years. The front line should be peaceful for a long time. However, out of the Federation's and even the entire universe's judgment, on the day the Federation's parliament began to impeach the president, the Empire's military launched an unprecedentedly fierce attack on the Federation. Furthermore, the strategic attack range this time had even exceeded planet Emohua and spread to several other war zones in the universe. The Empire's military, which had been lying low for several months, suddenly burst out and used the last of the Empire's fleet. The imperial family even used ruthless means to directly conscript all the smuggled spaceships in Galaxy L. Faced with thousands of Empire's civilian armed spaceships that covered the sky and covered the Earth, and were not afraid of death, the Federal fleet, which was hovering on one side of the Zwitian galaxy, watched as their energy supply rapidly decreased. However, they did not obtain an overwhelming advantage. They could only passively leave the main war zones and watch as the ground forces fell into a fierce battle with the Empire's army. The Empire's ground forces fiercely pushed forward on several planets. Their commanders did not seem to care at all whether it was soldiers or mud that fell under the Federation mecha. Nor did they care whether there were still allies in the area covered by the bombardment of the cluster formation bases. They only cared about advancing, and advancing. The battle on planet Emohua was the most intense. The surface forces led by the three Empire's Royal Mecha Brigades successfully drove the Federal forces out of the Straits War Zone and the Southwest War Zone, after paying a heavy price of 400 Wolf Fong mecha being destroyed. Faced with this kind of almost berserk method of advancement, the Federation's Lieutenant General Hu Lian, who was known for his iron chain defense, was bitterly disappointed before the battle even started. Meanwhile, the Empire's commander Huai Chaosher made a few extremely small mistakes in the Federation's command, and all of them were caught by the Empire's commander-in-chief, Huai Chaosher, and then dealt the most accurate and fatal blow. The Federation's ground forces on planet Emohua were forced to retreat under the powerful attacks of the Empire's army. In the few war zones that were separated, some of the troops were even forced to move to the dangerous mountainous areas and began a bleak long-term campaign. In this battle, Her Royal Highness the Princess, whose name shook the universe with her unparalleled strength in mecha warfare, finally proved that she also had the same genius ability in battlefield command. If it wasn't for the new 17th Division and Madman Lee in the Beheading Happiness mecha, who fought almost crazily in a bloody battle and held back the two Empire's Royal Mecha Brigades on the northwest front line, perhaps in less than 24 hours, Huai Chaosher and her subordinates would have already killed their way to the Federation's base. On this day, on the smoke-filled front line of planet Emohua, who knew how many Federation soldiers were injured, how many Federation soldiers were sacrificed, and how many Empire officers who were gradually calming down silently thought, if the one commanding the Federal forces right now was still Du Shaoqing, would all of this have happened? The Federation's General Du Shaoqing, who was supposed to be commanding the Federal forces and fighting the Empire at the front line, was transferred back to the capital ring by the government due to some political reasons. Then, at this time, he became a silent normal sniper, standing beside a military vehicle and continuously shooting at a certain someone on the mountaintop, as if his life was on the line. The crisp sound of metal striking rang out. The high-speed bullet hit the hard mecha's protective panel and bounced off, brushing past Iron 7 Division's Commander Liu Yongfu's cheek and shattering the glass of the military vehicle. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he subconsciously wanted to find a place to hide. But looking at the back of the general in front of him who was coldly aiming and shooting with a gun, he didn't dare to move his legs at all. The frontline battle report had already been sent back to the capital ring, and he looked at Du Shaoqing's back with a complicated expression, guessing what exactly was in his mind at this moment. On the mountaintop, Su Lu was holding his ACW and firing at the road below with an unusually calm expression. There was already a wound on the right side of his cheek caused by the shattered rocks, and blood was slowly flowing out of it. At this moment, he wasn't thinking about anything. From the corner of his eyes, he saw the Iron 7 Division's mecha approaching at high speed. He knew very well that in this situation, the more he thought, the faster he would die. Chapter 973. Even though there was a distance of several kilometers between them, the powerful tungsten alloy tail fins and large caliber bullets still had terrifying kinetic energy. They easily drilled into the seemingly solid rock and rotated violently at high speed, blasting out countless sharp rocks and blinding dust. His left cheek was cut by a piece of rock, His blood and sweat mixed with the dust to form a colorless dye, together with the sport's windbreaker full of holes. He looked exceptionally pitiful. The mixture of blood and sweat flowed into the corner of his eyes, piercing his eyes slightly. He subconsciously opened fire with the ACW in his hand. Looking at the military vehicle in the distance beside the road, a clear bullet point was only a little bit away from Du Shaoqing. Su Le couldn't help but curse under his breath, lamenting his luck and his misfortune. The slight numbness from his military boots made him realize that at this moment, whether he wanted to or not, if he didn't retreat in time, only death would await him. The two ACWs on the mountaintop and the road fired more than 20 rounds at each other. The 10 MX mechas scattered at the foot of the mountain from Iron 7 Division were already close to the top of the rock. Su Le was the engineer who understood the MX mecha the best in this universe. He knew that ever since the counterattack in the West Woods, the Federation had begun large-scale mecha battles. All of the MX standard mechas had their long-range weapons removed. For example, the main cannon that was designed back then was only left with the Darlin's autocannon. During that period of time, he had calmly stood on the rock and played cool with Du Shaoqing. It was precisely because he had calculated that those Iron 7 Division mechas, that seemed extremely close to him, would not be able to threaten him. And now those 10 MX mechas were close enough. The area at the top of the rock had entered the range of the mecha's firepower. He could faintly hear the buzzing sound of the mechas on the mountainside. It was not the sound of dual engines, but the sound of the Darlin's autocannon rotating at high speed. What was even more frightening was that the three black mechas charging at the very front were beginning to shake off their components and enter overclocking mode. The time left for Su Le to react, if accurately calculated, was less than a second. With only 1 second left, Su Le carried the heavy ACW and the heavy military backpack. With a grunt, he jumped down the cliff without hesitation. Almost at the same time as he leapt into the cliff, a dense rain of Darling's cannonballs ferociously bombarded the boulder, instantly chipping off an entire layer of the boulder. Su Le landed heavily on a pine tree in the middle of the white stone cliff. Just when the pine tree couldn't withstand the huge force and made a cracking sound, his body bounced up at high speed again like a spring. His empty left arm stretched out in the air as he grabbed onto a protruding rock in front of him. His body swung in the air and disappeared into the corner of the cliff. This series of actions seemed easy, casual, and natural, but in reality, Su Le had performed extremely precise calculations beforehand to be able to use his inhuman abilities to succeed. Entering the corner of the rock wall, behind him was a deep valley that was no longer green and only yellow. Carrying a heavy military backpack, he quickly ran into the valley. The huge backpack seemed to want to cover his entire body. But the strange thing was, he didn't know why he always held the two guns horizontally. He would rather sacrifice some speed in running than carry them on his back, or carry them with one hand. A moment later, the loud roar of engines tore through the mountain path that had just been quiet for a moment. Three black mechas, already in overclocking mode, broke through the mountain rocks and gave chase with a ferocious momentum. Behind them, almost 10 mechas followed. At this time, Su Le had already charged about 300 meters into the valley like a flash of lightning. He suddenly stopped running at high speed. His military boots dug deep into the mud to dissolve the huge inertia. His body twisted under the support of terrifying strength and pulled the triggers at the three black mechas behind him. Pa! Pa! Not conforming to the norms of any military tactics manual, and beyond the imagination of the strongest warrior, Su Le, who was being chased by the mechas, actually had the time to turn around and fire 2 shots at lightning speed. This was why after leaving the cliff, he would rather sacrifice running speed to maintain the posture of holding his pistols with both hands. It was because he needed to ensure the speed of his shots. At such a close distance, the Federation's Gun King, ACW, definitely had the ability to shoot through the sturdy alloy plates of the mechas. The three black MX mechas behind him obviously knew this. At this time, these excellent pilots of the Iron 7th Division also displayed their excellent control skills. None of the three black mechas made any movement to slow down or evade. Instead, They suddenly crossed their fists in front of their chests and used their thick mechanical arms to protect the cockpit. The two armor-piercing bullets that Sulu had been preparing for a long time hit the mechanical arm of the black mecha at the front. Two sparks flashed, and the black mecha's mechanical arm emitted green smoke. However, the mecha itself did not suffer any damage. Its speed did not even decrease in the slightest. The black mecha crossed its fists in front of its chest. Its movements seemed clumsy, and even a little comical, but it was actually very effective against the terrifying ACW. This was the most powerful tactic of the Iron 7th Division. Sulu was still running with his head down. The three Iron 7th Division mechas were still in pursuit. In just a few seconds, they had covered hundreds of meters again. However, no matter how strong the human body was, it could not compare to the energy of the quantum beam jet of the twin engines. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. Just as it seemed that he was about to enter a desperate situation, Sulu burst out again. However, this time, he did not use the powerful strength of his legs to stop his forward momentum. Instead, he stomped on the ground with his military boots. His entire body flew up, and he completed a twisting motion in midair. He flew smoothly backwards like a bird in the winter valley, his body balance perfectly maintained. He leveled his ACW and looked expressionlessly at the nearest Iron 7th Division mecha. Pa, 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 pa. 3 shots. The 3 bullets avoided the clumsy mechanical arm of the Iron 7th Division mecha in front of the cockpit. They seemed to be unintentional, but in fact, they accurately hit the hidden guard behind the mecha's shoulder blade. In the minds of most Federation pilots, the hidden guard with 6 screws was like the cecum of a human's abdomen. It was completely useless. However, in the eyes of a certain person who designed MX, the hidden guard was like the skull of a human head. Below it were densely packed data cables. Once they were opened in his hands, he would be able to directly control the mecha. I'll kill you in 3 shots. Look at that perfect angle, that precise wedging force. Sulu muttered to himself as he breathed heavily. He ran up the steep hill. From the corner of his eyes, he glanced behind him from time to time. He found that the 10 or so Iron 7th Division mechas behind him had not yet closed in. Because of the terrain, the 3 Black MX mechas at the front were gradually pulling away from him. The Black MX that he had hit 5 times in a row was the closest to him. It was also the most aggressive. However, in Suli's eyes, this Black MX was like a delicious piece of cake. He held his ACW and breathed rapidly, silently chanting in his mind. Closer. A little closer. Those behind slow down a little. It was truly a pipe dream for him to think that he could defeat Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7 masters with just 1 person or 7 teams to fight against the federal government. However, for him, if he had a powerful mecha, perhaps the situation would be fundamentally changed. After the battle 3 years ago, the Federation government began to strictly control the use of military mechas. They were protected by multiple layers of passwords. When they were not activated, even Sulu would not be able to successfully steal them. Today's scene was the result of Suli's calculations. He knew that the mecha group of Iron 7th Division would definitely catch up, and this would be the best chance for him to steal the mecha. Stealing a military mecha with his bare hands. In the eyes of many people, this was akin to a myth. No one would believe it, but Sulu had seen Uncle Feng Yu go crazy before. In fact, he had even played out a similar scene on Emohua Planet. Today, Sulu did not have an engineering mecha, nor did he have a miniature repair arm. However, he had his ACW. Seemingly unintentionally, he had been shooting at the hidden guard all this time. His goal was to force the guard open, and then find a chance to flip over and use the data under the guard to directly take control of the Black MX. Once he got his hands on the mecha, it would be Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division's turn to fret. That Du Shaoqing watched as the blurry figure disappeared over the side of the cliff. He watched as the 10 or so mecha chased after it. Expressionlessly, he took back his ACW and handed it to the officer beside him. Then, he picked up his sunglasses and gently blew off the dust on the lenses before putting them on and walking towards the military vehicle. Suddenly his sword-like eyebrows shot up. He abruptly turned around to look at the rocky peak that was now nowhere to be seen. He remembered the battle report Li Feng had sent back from Emohua planet a few days ago, and remembered the MX mecha that Su Lo had successfully captured. His raised eyebrows suddenly sank. Du Xiaoqing said in a low voice, "Withdraw all mecha," including Division Commander Lu Yongfu and all the staff officers. No one understood why the division's mecha had to withdraw just as they were about to catch up and eliminate that damned sniper. However, the discipline of the Iron 7th Division was as strict as a mountain. Facing this division commander Xiaoqing, who was no longer a division commander, everyone was used to following orders without questioning or questioning. The order for the mecha group to withdraw immediately reached the mountain valley in the shortest amount of time possible. Du Xiaoqing stared silently in the direction of the deep mountain valley through his sunglasses, and then ordered, "Troops continue forward. Target is the 1st Unified Special District." The surrounding Iron 7th Division officers were slightly taken aback. Then, some of them understood Division Commander Xiaoqing's meaning. As long as the troops did not disperse and use several mecha to seal off the shooting angles in the direction of the mountain range, what could the sniper in the mountain do? The other party could only watch as this flood of steel silently and unstoppably entered the capital's special district. There was nothing they could do. This was Du Xiaoqing. This was the Iron 7th Division. This division and its core figure sometimes looked a little too mechanical and cold, but they yearned for victory but were not greedy for it. Their eyes were clear, their steps firm. They may not be the strongest division, but they were definitely the division that made the least number of mistakes. Du Xiaoqing sat back in the car with an expressionless face. He didn't look at the handcuffed officer beside him. He slowly undid the top button of the general's uniform, dissipating the heat in his body. Then, he silently thought of the previous moment. Why did he inexplicably hold an ACW and shoot at Su Le? If this had happened on the battlefield, this would have been an absolutely unforgivable mistake. He, who was known to never make mistakes, slowly frowned, feeling very puzzled. Chapter 974. The handcuffed officer was the commander of Iron 7th Division's 2nd Regiment, Zhou Yu. Back then, he was a top student of the 1st Military Academy. Du Xiaoqing had recognized his talent and forcefully summoned him from Macho and Su Li's underlings to Iron 7th Division. Then, the gentle young man gradually matured on the battlefield. Zhou Yu was highly regarded by Du Xiaoqing. As an officer famous for his tactical deduction, Zhou Yu held an important position in Iron 7th Division. But now, he was just a prisoner in the back of a military vehicle. The phone call from the president's residence reached Iron 7th Division's base. Du Xiaoqing ordered all troops to set off for the capital. No one in Iron 7th Division questioned this military order. At this time, Zhou Yu stood up. In front of everyone, he took out his gun and silently placed it on the table in front of Du Xiaoqing. He used this most extreme action to express his strongest opposition. Zhou Yu's bold stand did not affect Du Xiaoqing's decision, at least on the surface. After he was arrested, the Iron 7th Division set off on time, and he was stuffed into the back of Du Xiaoqing's military vehicle and forced to follow them to the capital. "Commander, you made a mistake just now." The current commander of Iron 7th Division was Lu Yongfu, but as long as Du Xiaoqing appeared in this unit, the Iron 7th Division would only call him commander. Zhou Yu, whose hands were cuffed behind his back, did not look at Du Xiaoqing. His eyes fell on the valley in front of them and said, "Why did you make a mistake? Because even you don't know if this is the right thing to do. And I firmly believe that this is wrong. Federal forces interfering in political affairs is a serious violation of the spirit of the Charter. Commander, even the Empire people in the valley understand this, and even risked their lives to stop you. Why don't you understand?" Du Xiaoqing's expression did not change at all when he heard his subordinate's angry objections from the back seat. His cold eyes drifted slightly as the military vehicle moved. After a moment of silence, he replied indifferently, "Back then, in the building of the Ministry of National Defense, Su Le once pointed at my nose and said that the army should not have its own thoughts. A soldier's duty is to obey orders. Mr. Pabre is the elected president. As a soldier, what's wrong with obeying his orders? If the mobilization of military forces this time violates the spirit of the charter as you said, why didn't the Bureau of Proclamation do anything? Hearing Du Xiaoqing's explanation, Zhou Yu smiled with some difficulty, no longer trying to convince the other. He understood the general sitting in front of him very well. He was a man of few words, and disdained to explain any details of his plans to his subordinates. But today, he had actually opened his mouth to explain something, which was rare for him. What did this mean? It could only mean that he was constantly looking for reasons to strengthen his resolve. The engine hummed, and the military vehicle slowly started moving. A cool breeze blew in from the window, and the temperature dropped a little. The expressionless Du Xiaoqing still seemed to feel a little hot, and he unbuttoned the second button of his military uniform. Precise calculations, powerful mobility, and an impeccable plan to lure the enemy in with the flow of the situation had created this seemingly futile, but actually murderous opportunity to flee for his life in the valley. However, just as he was about to carry out his plan and set off a heaven-defying wave, he found that the black MX mecha closest to him had already quietly retreated at some point in time, leaving only 2 trees in this place. This was like an excellent boxer who did not hesitate to hold his head and take a beating passively, getting beaten until his nose was bruised and his face was swollen and bleeding profusely, pretending to be weak and stalling for time until he finally found the moment to land the fatal blow. He viciously threw out the right heavy punch that he had hidden for 11 rounds, only to suddenly realize that the punch was aimed at empty air. Su Lo, whose face was covered in blood and stains, stared blankly at the 2 trees. He watched as the dozen or so Iron 7 Division mecha retreated into the wilderness at the bottom of the mountain range. He stood there like that pitiful boxer, dumbly standing in place. He ran back to the cliff near the mountain range and looked down at the steel troops that had already finished organizing and were neatly marching towards the capital. He couldn't help but frown deeply. The Iron 7 Division had dealt with his thousands of changes by remaining motionless. The difference in strength was too great, so this was destined to be the most conservative and least wrong way of dealing with him. Facing the terrifying steel torrent at the bottom of the mountain range, what else could he do other than engage in meaningless harassment along the way? More than 100 black MX mechas were spread out in the wilderness. 7 of them were closely following the dark green military vehicle on the road, closely covering any long-range sniping range from any angle. Hundreds of armored vehicles followed behind, and the army of more than 10,000 people maintained a perfect formation as they slowly advanced in the direction of the capital. Other than the roar of the engines, there was no other sound to be heard, giving people a silent, oppressive, austere, and unstoppable feeling. Su Lu suppressed his rapid breathing and stroked the hot body of the ACW. He looked down at the silent Iron 7 Division under his feet and couldn't help but feel a strong sense of defeat. Right now, there was no force around the capital that could be a match for Du Xiaoqing's Iron 7 Division. Once this army entered the capital, what would the people who were also known as the Silent Marching Army face? Along the way, a certain someone tried his best to snipe, but he was still as powerless as the mosquitoes flying around the bison on the other side of the Donglin electronic fence. The bison that silently ate grass didn't care about the bullets in the air at all. It only occasionally swung its tail to hit them, and a certain someone had to retreat into the mountain range at high speed like a mosquito fleeing for its life. It seemed that there was no force that could stop the Iron 7 Division from entering the capital. However, at this moment, the silent steel torrent suddenly stopped outside an inconspicuous town. It was an Iron 7 Division that stopped the advance of the Iron 7 Division, nor was it Blackhawk Security Company, nor was it the Zhong family troops from the West Woods who suddenly learned how to travel through space, nor was it the Imperial armies who madly followed the Crown Prince. It was just a man covered in dirt and bleeding wounds like a beggar. No beggar, not even the beggar gang leader in Schiller's 8, could slow down the pace of the Iron 7 Division at all. However, this beggar was Dongfang Yu, the former commander of the Iron 7 Division. Many of the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7 Division in the armored vehicles in front of him were personally selected by him and promoted to be his subordinates. Dongfang Yu, who was holding a pair of crutches, looked at the armored vehicle that slowly stopped in front of him. An abnormal flush of excitement appeared on his face. He supported himself with his crutches and struggled to move forward. The wounds on his body that were left a few days ago were now bleeding. The current commander of the Iron 7 Division, Lu Yongfu, who had received the news, quickly rushed to the front of the troop. Looking at Dongfang Yu, who looked like a miserable beggar, his pupils shrank. He reached out to help him, and then take him away. Unexpectedly, Dongfang Yu pushed him away and shouted in a deep voice, "Get lost!" As the most senior officer of the Iron 7 Division, as one of the first subordinates to follow Du Xiaoqing, as one of the arms who was as famous as Shimin Jin, in Dongfang Yu's eyes, no one in the Iron 7 Division was qualified to talk to him, except for his real commander Du Xiaoqing. When she arrived in front of the dark green military vehicle, Dongfang Yu struggled free from the support of the two majors. She threw away her crutches and limped forward quickly. She shouted at Du Xiaoqing, who was standing beside the vehicle, "Commander, you can't go. You can't ruin your reputation for those shameless politicians. You've been wronged." Du Xiaoqing looked at Dongfang Yu, who was crying like a wronged child. Looking at this man who had been following him for more than a decade, he rubbed his head and gently explained, "I know what happened on the Ink Flower planet. That was caused by that trash Hu Lian. But I can assure you that Mr. President didn't know about it beforehand." Dongfang Yu wiped the tears on his face with his sour sleeve. Hearing his commander's explanation, he couldn't help but angrily take 2 steps back and shouted, "The president didn't know? Then what about the ancient bell? That was done by Shimin Jin. How could the president not know? Commander, could it be that Shimin Jin is dead, so we can just let him be the scapegoat for that black-faced president?" Du Xiaoqing's face suddenly stiffened, and he shouted in a deep voice, "Enough! Not enough." Dongfang Yu's temper had always been sour and irritable, otherwise he wouldn't have caused such a big mess with the Iron 7th Division. Among the oldest officers of the Iron 7th Division, Du Xiaoqing was famous for being good at guessing Du Xiaoqing's intentions, and he was famous for being the only one who dared to debate with Du Xiaoqing. Because of those stupid politicians, I was shot on the battlefield, and my intestines flowed out in 2 basins, and then I stuffed them back in. I was lying on a stretcher in the southwest war zone of the Ink Flower planet for several months. I was carried by those little bastards that I originally looked down on, and ran all over the place to hide, and only then did I survive. If the president didn't know about this murder at the beginning, then what about later? Why did they still want to silence me after I returned to the Federation? Dongfang Yu abruptly tore off her tattered clothes, revealing her bony chest and abdomen. Other than the terrifying old scar on her abdomen, there were also countless recent wounds. Now those wounds were bleeding incessantly, and the stench of pus had been washed away. It was a horrible sight to behold. The surrounding Iron 7th Division officers looked at the miserable wounds on his body, and their faces became very ugly. "Commander, look at these wounds on my body." Dongfang Yu stared at Du Xiaoqing's face and shouted sternly, "From the first day I returned to the Federation, the government's special forces began to hunt us down, and that NTR team member, who followed me, only lasted for 2 days before he died. I let him down. If I let him follow Iron 7th Division, or even leave with Su Lu, perhaps he wouldn't have died. He didn't deserve to die. We endured so long and suffered so much to escape from the Ink Flower planet. But in the end, he died in the Federation. I can't accept this, Commander." His voice was full of hatred towards the Federation government and that president, and he shouted mournfully, "They wanted to kill me, but am I dead? No, even if my body is so rotten, I'm still alive. Why? Because they forgot that I was once a soldier of the Iron 7th Division." "Commander, that day when you volunteered to become the commander of the independent battalion in the 7th Division, you told me and Shimin that since you were born in the Iron 7th Division, you can't die so casually." "Commander, I'm not dead. Commander, I went to NTR for 4 whole years, and I didn't look like a human, nor a ghost, but I didn't want to commit suicide, and I endured it. Why? Because I didn't want to lose face for the Iron 7th Division. Dong Fengyu stared at Du Xiaoqing with bloodshot eyes, raised his chin proudly, and said loudly, "That's why I didn't want my most respected commander Du Xiaoqing to do something that would lose face for the entire Iron 7th Division. Unless commander doesn't recognize me as a soldier of the Iron 7th Division, then let the mecha run over me." Du Xiaoqing looked at him silently, his chest rising and falling slightly under his dark green military uniform. Suddenly, he raised his arm and chopped at the left side of Dong Fengyu's neck, and then he didn't look at the unconscious person in the arms of the other officers, and directly turned to walk towards the military vehicle, shouting just before he boarded, "Medic! Here! Keep him alive!" Yes. Sitting in the front passenger seat of the military vehicle, Du Xiaoqing glanced at Zhou Yu's face from the corner of his eye. Zhou Yu was clearly expressionless at this time, but Du Xiaoqing somehow felt that he saw a faint trace of mockery. Dong Fengyu was once the commander of the 1st Division, and Zhou Yu was the current commander of the 2nd Division. These two soldiers, both with the word Yu in their names, were once his most trusted subordinates, but today, Du Xiaoqing suddenly felt inexplicably anxious, and his body was a little hot. His straight eyebrows slowly furrowed, and he subconsciously undid the 3rd button of his well-ironed uniform. Perhaps it was fate's arrangement, but on this day, the Iron 7th Division's march towards the capital seemed to be unstoppable, but on the road, they were constantly forced to stop moving forward. After the troops entered the suburbs of Wangdu, they stopped again. All the mecha, vehicles, and soldiers vigilantly watched their surroundings, guarding against attacks that could come at any time. This time, they were forced to stop moving forward because there was a serious traffic jam on Highway 2 from Wangdu to the capital. The military MX mecha could naturally continue to advance at high speed through the fields, but the hundreds of armored vehicles and military vehicles could not do so. If they wanted to enter the capital to control the situation and maintain order, it was far from enough to rely solely on the heavy lethal mecha. The hundreds of armored vehicles and military vehicles of the Iron 7th Division did not enter Highway 2. The troops were waiting for the engineering mecha to open up the communication and auxiliary roads, and then enter the military passage. This was a situation that had been planned, so Du Xiaoqing was not anxious at this time. He looked at the traffic jam outside the window, and his long frown slowly relaxed. Outside the window, there was a crowded crowd in traffic. Countless civilian cars, accompanied by cheerful honks, rushed into Highway 2, and then drove towards the city in the distance. The shadows of more than 100 military mecha covered both sides of the road, and the hundreds of armored vehicles silently formed a long line. The sudden arrival of the federal forces brought great shock to the citizens of Wangdu. There were small car accidents, and more civilian vehicles subconsciously made a detour. The crowd also quickly dispersed, and countless pairs of eyes fell on the armored vehicles and mecha warily. Where are these troops from? Why are they here? What do they want to do? Don't be afraid, I think, it's the Iron 7th Division. It's the Iron 7th Division. Among the crowd of onlookers on both sides of the road, there were civilian military enthusiasts who recognized the designation of this unit from the equipment and painted insignia. Whispers quickly spread around. Shocked gazes mixed with fear turned to confusion, and then to curiosity. The expressions of the citizens of Wangdu changed from stiff to relaxed, and many people even laughed, pointing at the mecha in the distance, and discussing the advanced equipment of the Iron 7th Division with the people beside them. Since the Westwood's counterattack in year 67 of the constitutional calendar, the federal military units that appeared the most on the television screen were the Iron 7th Division and the 7th Division. With the exposure of Su Li's identity, the 7th Division had long been forgotten, but the Iron 7th Division still firmly held the #1 position in terms of exposure, and also held the #1 position in the hearts of the Federation people. In the hearts of all the Federation people, the Iron 7th Division was the flag of resistance against the invasion of the Empire, the embodiment of justice in the Federation, and the most reliable steel division in the Federation. The people on the side of the road, and in the cars did not know why this silent and solemn iron division of the Federation had appeared in Wangdu. They were curious about where the Iron 7th Division was going and what they were going to do, but not a single person was worried, because they firmly believed that no matter what this heroic Federation unit did, it was protecting the interests of the Federation and the people. A brave boy broke free from his companion's grip and ran towards the black MX mecha. He ran past the shadow of the mecha on the ground and ran to the palm of the mecha that was taller than him. He looked up curiously at the huge and mighty mecha body in the air and carefully reached out a finger to touch it. A vegetarian girl who had just bought fresh vegetables and was about to drive back to the Wangdu Youth Apartments walked out of the market in the suburbs. When she saw the armored vehicle in front of her, she screamed in fright and quickly covered her mouth. She knew which unit this was from the discussion of the aunties beside her. She looked at the expressionless but very handsome young soldier on the armored vehicle, and her eyes began to become infatuated. She raised her hand and sent him a shy flying kiss. The communication and auxiliary roads in front had been opened, and the Iron 7th Division was preparing to enter the special road for military supplies. The armored vehicle slowly started to move. The young soldier on the vehicle saw the girl enthusiastically send him a flying kiss, and could no longer maintain his cold expression. He awkwardly waved his hand in response. At this moment, in the turbulent situation of the Federation, any small, unconscious gesture could lead to many interesting conjectures or misunderstandings, let alone the Iron 7th Division. Seeing the young soldiers on the armored vehicle waving their hands in response, some rookies on the side of the road, who had just started to hang out in the Military History Saturn forum, came to the wrong conclusion and began to excitedly announce their speculations to the people around them. Thus, the reaction of the Wangdu citizens around the road was more than enthusiastic, and some even began to whistle to express their welcome. With a soft thud, something smashed through the crowd and luckily passed through the half-lowered window, landing on Du Shaoqing's knees. The officers of the Iron 7th Division were shocked. They reacted quickly and pulled out their guns to counterattack. Du Shaoqing waved his hand to indicate that they should not be nervous and said calmly, "People like Su Le won't shoot in a place like this." After saying this, he picked up the fresh flower on his knees and fell silent, relying on the river-like Jinqi in his body and the compressed energy bars in his backpack. Su Le ran 170 kilometers through the steep mountains and finally arrived at the suburbs of Wangdu that he was familiar with. His speed was not much slower than the fully mechanized Iron 7th Division, but in order to achieve this, he had paid a heavy price. His body was exhausted to the extreme, and he did not have the time or strength to wipe the sweat and blood off his cheeks. He looked battered and exhausted. In an electrician's room under the overpass, he watched the Iron 7th Division armored vehicles enter the special military passage one by one. He slowly released his index finger from the ACW trigger converter. It was still Schiller who said, "The person who understands you the most is not your friend, but your enemy." Du Shaoqing and Su Lu understood each other very well, so as Du Shaoqing had calmly predicted, he did not choose to shoot in a crowded area. "Fei Gu, did you connect in?" Su Lu licked his dry lips and said tiredly to the system, "We can't stop the Iron 7th Division. We can only try the last stupid method." The interior of the military vehicle was very spacious. In addition to the 3 rows of seats, there was also the most important command system of the Iron 7th Division. The communications officer wearing the headset suddenly turned his head and said nervously, "Commander, someone has synchronized with the division's communication system and is requesting to speak directly with you. He said he is Su Lu." Du Shaoqing frowned slightly. After a moment of silence, he took the communication device and said coldly, "I am Du Shaoqing." When he was young, Su Lu would occasionally show his sharp and sarcastic side. However, after he started running for his life, he became quieter and quieter. More often than not, he would only grin and reveal his white teeth, or say a few simple but blunt proclamations that could kill people. So no matter how one looked at it, he was not a suitable candidate for negotiation. However, the Federation was facing an unprecedented danger, and there were not many people that Du Xiaoqing was interested in negotiating with. Du Xiaoqing, I hate you. His first sentence fully demonstrated Su Li's negotiating style. Or it could be said that other than angering Du Xiaoqing, so that the Iron 7th Division could advance faster, he had no other ability. I hate that military uniform of yours that is ironed 3 times a day. I hate that deadpan face of yours that looks like everyone in the Federation owes you money. I hate the smell of ice on your body. I hate that hair of yours that is neatly combed like a frozen grassland. Of course, your sunglasses are not bad. I hate the way you scolded Zhou Yu and the others in the training base. I hate your arrogance and callousness, thinking that I'll always be the best in the world. I hate it the most when you and your troops live like fucking cold machines. And in order to prove that you adhere to the philosophy of the collective always before the individual, even when the Iron 7th Division has been fully equipped with MX, you still refuse to enter the cockpit of your mecha. Don't you find this pretentious and disgusting? But no matter how much I hate you, it is difficult for me to have any doubts about you on the battlefield. Many years ago, at the front line of solitary Yellow Mountain Ridge in Base 5460, my mecha had been running for an entire night. It couldn't have been worse. You asked me to take the risk to kill the enemy for the sake of the Iron 7th Division's ambush plan. I didn't hesitate and followed your orders, because I believed that you would not shoot your comrades in the back. Based on the same reason, Shi Qinghai found out that Shiman Jin was involved in the Linhai assassination and planned the explosion of the ancient bell. But I insisted that these things had nothing to do with you. I think that I understand you very well. I always thought that you were a model professional soldier. You were just doing your duty as a Federation soldier and following the orders of the Federation President and the government. But I have to remind you that what you are doing now has crossed that boundary. Stop, Du Xiaoqing. Even if you are still pretentious and want to be buried with Pabre, his government, and their ideals, even if you insist on being a professional soldier, why can't you wait a little longer? Just wait for a short period of time until the impeachment case is over. If the impeachment case is passed, Pabre will no longer be the Federation president. You don't need to follow his orders. If the impeachment case is not passed, he will still be the Federation president. Then, what is the need for you and your troops to make the situation more complicated? If you insist, then it proves that you are afraid. You are afraid that Mr. Pabre, whom you have followed for so many years, has been abandoned by the people. You can't stand firm anymore. Du Xiaoqing, why are you so silent? Because I have torn off your glorious mask of a professional soldier and let you see that the premise of this order is that Pabre is no longer the Federation president? Accepting an order that is not from the president or not needing to accept an order from the president or waiting is a good choice. This is not the paradox of twins in physics. This is a clear fact. After being silent for a long time, Du Xiaoqing finally calmly replied, "It has already been many years. I know how that tiger looked at me back then. I know how many people in the Federation look at me. They all think that I am an idealist who is calm on the outside, but fanatical on the inside. In reality, they are both wrong and right. Unlike the other people in the Trinity Association, I have never had the dream of overthrowing the 7 great families. The entire purpose of my life is to make the Federation strong and completely defeat the Empire. I am not interested in anything else. I don't care if the 7 great families control the Federation, or if a grassroots president rules the Federation. I only care about whose Federation can be strong enough to completely defeat the Empire. You and I both know that rotten meat like the 7 great families and politicians like the former president cannot do this. Only Mr. Pabre can destroy the 7 great families, and then make the Federation truly strong." After being silent for a period of time, Su Li's voice sounded again. "Du Xiaoqing, if the entire purpose of your life is to defeat the Empire, then you should know even more clearly that in this current situation, if you insist on standing on President Pabre's side, the Federation will inevitably fall into civil war. Your life's ideals may only turn into bubbles." Hearing the hoarse voice from the communication system, Du Xiaoqing was expressionless. He slowly undid the 4th button of his military uniform, the veins on the back of his right hand appearing and disappearing. The military uniform was always well ironed. The military boots were always shiny, the black kid gloves, the black sunglasses, the neatly combed hair, and the impeccable military posture were the only images this Federation general and national idol left behind. However, at this very moment, the front of his hair was a bit messy and his well-ironed military uniform was undone. He was far from that perfect image of a general. Su Lo, I used to think that I understood you very well, but after this day, I still have a question that I haven't found the answer to. Why did you, a citizen of the Empire, come to the Federation to do these things? Why did you use the result of the Federation defeating the Empire to tempt me? You may not know, but Huaichaosher has already started a counterattack on planet Emohua, while the Federation is in civil war. If you are like her, trying to take advantage of the Federation's chaos to gain benefits for the Empire, then you should be very happy to see this scene. Just as you said, the West Woods will declare independence, but the Federation will fall into civil war. Why? Because this is not a war between two countries to begin with. Su Li's voice was emotionless as he replied in a deep voice. There may not be such things as justice in a war between countries, but at other times there may be. Du Shaoqing said with slight sarcasm. The youth of the Empire wants to talk about justice again. I admit that to me, this matter should be more of a personal vendetta. My ultimate goal is very simple. I just want Pabre and those people to be judged. However, whether this result can be realized or not is justice for those who have already died, even if it is overdue justice. There is no justice in a national war, no heroes in civil war. In the dark green military vehicle, Du Shaoqing looked at the flower he was fiddling with and was silent for a very long time. Then, the corners of his lips curled up slightly as he said in a sarcastic tone, "If you want me to stop, then beg me." After a moment of silence in the communication system, Su Li's unprecedentedly serious and sincere voice rang out. "Commander Shaoqing, I beg you." Passing through the metal bridge temporarily built by the huge engineering mecha, hundreds of armored vehicles were parked silently at the entrance to the military tunnel in the suburbs of Wangdu. More than 100 black MX mecha were spread out in the wilderness beside the tunnel, vigilantly observing the surrounding movements, ready to launch suppressive fire at any moment. Su Lo, who was being closely guarded by the Iron 7th Division, did not feel too proud at this time. Through the ACW's aiming equipment, he watched as the well-ironed general in his military uniform walked into the armed helicopter under heavy protection. He watched as the 7 dark-colored armed helicopters rose into the air in the light snow above Wangdu. The string of nerves that had been stretched taut all this time suddenly loosened. Fatigue and pain instantly took over his entire body. He held onto the wall of the electrical workshop to prevent himself from collapsing. Negotiating with Du Shaoqing seemed to be more stressful than engaging in a life-and-death battle with Madman Li. But could this be considered a success? He did not know. He could not even understand why Du Shaoqing would be so easily convinced by him and leave the Iron 7th Division's main force with only one company of soldiers. This was because he did not know about Zhou Yu, who was handcuffed in the back of the military vehicle, or Dongfang Yu, who was still unconscious like a beggar in the medical vehicle. He also did not know about the delicate flower that had been thrown into the military vehicle. Nor did he know that Du Shaoqing had unbuttoned 4 buttons in a row. Su Lo was now even more puzzled by the other's words about the meaning of life. Thinking back to the fierce, violent, and even incomparably cold-blooded attacks this person had launched against the Empire's troops on Emohua planet these past few years, he really wanted to know where exactly Du Shaoqing's bone-deep hatred for the Empire's people came from. Everyone had a part of their heart that was as gentle as jade. It was just that they needed to carefully polish it to peel off the surface layer that might be ideals, obsessions, or desires. Then, they would let the jade heart gently bloom, illuminating themselves and those around them. Dongfang Yu's hard shell was slowly worn away by Su Lo and the Iron 7th Division's attitude and actions on Emohua planet. On this day, Su Li's bullets could not stop Du Shaoqing, and Su Li's words could not persuade him. It was only because of Zhou Yu, Dongfang Yu, and that flower that he slowly unbuttoned his military uniform, that he had never undone in front of outsiders, that he had already made his decision. No matter how important external factors seemed to be, the most difficult choice had to be made by oneself in the end. Dozens of Special Task Force agents in black suits quickly set up a cordon. 7 dark-colored armed helicopters landed on the wide lawn in front of the president's official residence. The snow had just fallen from the sky and was not heavy, but the strong wind from the helicopter's rotors rolled up the snow that covered the lawn and tore the snow into pieces. It was like a snowstorm had struck. President Pobre stood by the window of the Oval Office and watched the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division disembark from the armed helicopters one after another. He looked at the general, who was at the front of the group walking towards the official residence. The expression on his face changed from anger to deep disappointment, and finally into a deathly silence. He walked to his desk and listened to the heavy door behind him open. He did not turn around. He slowly filled his glass with hard liquor, and then quietly looked at the amber liquid in the glass for a long time. I already thought that Shunli might have a problem. So is it your turn to have a problem now? President Pobre asked with mixed feelings. He reached out and held the glass as if he wanted to drink it in one gulp, but for some reason, he slowly let go. He held the edge of the table with both hands, leaned forward slightly, and lowered his head. Du Xiaoqing walked into the Oval Office with no expression on his face. He took off his military cap and held it between his arms. He saluted with a bang. After a moment of silence, he said, "Yes, I have a problem." President Pobre did not ask Du Xiaoqing what the problem was. He said self-deprecatingly, "When everyone has a problem, then it is obvious that the person who has a problem should be me." After saying this, his body seemed to become unusually heavy. His tired hands holding the edge of the table could no longer bear it. His broad back trembled slightly, like a mountain that was about to collapse. His wife refused to come down from the bedroom upstairs. His daughter had not eaten at the same table as him in the bedroom upstairs for 3 years. Outside the window of the official residence, the slogans of the silent marching crowd could be faintly heard. These people used to be his staunchest supporters 3 years ago. Countless staff members were still nervously busy inside and outside the official residence. Hundreds of Special Task Force agents were dutifully guarding their posts. Supporters were still by the railings outside the lawn. Du Xiaoqing was behind him. However, President Pobre's figure seemed particularly lonely, as if he was alone. "Mr. President, I think that there is a problem with the emergency plan from Chairman Li Jiedu. At the same time, I insist that he is not a real soldier, nor is he a simple politician. He is a strange deformed child. If the Federation continues to follow his plan, it will be very dangerous." Du Xiaoqing looked at the back of the president with mixed feelings and guilt. President Pobre put his hands on the table and was silent for a long time. Then, as if he had sensed something, he subconsciously raised his head and looked at the people who supported him outside the lawn. He saw the angry middle-aged men who were ready to stop the silent march in tears. He saw the young students who cheered for the arrival of the armed fighters of the Iron 7th Division. It was as if he saw himself passionately distributing leaflets and protesting loudly in the streets. His mind buzzed like thunder. "Nowhere my dish, I like it." Chapter 975. The Oval Office was silent for a long time. President Pobre held the edge of the table and looked out the window at the people in the wind and snow with a complicated expression. He suddenly asked, "Why?" Du Xiaoqing, who was standing behind him, was silent for a moment before replying. "The NTR officer of the new 17th Division that the government is hunting down these days was once my subordinate." President Pobre furrowed his brows. A heavy self-deprecating expression appeared on his tanned face. He said sorry. "No need," Du Xiaoqing replied. Indeed, there was no need to apologize. The expression on the face of this famous Federation general had already returned to calmness. He had taken the Razor Company of the Iron 7th Division and parachuted into the official residence in an armed helicopter, but he had left all of the main forces. the more than 100 military mechas and hundreds of armored vehicles, in Wangdu. This had already made his attitude and his choice clear. This choice was the heaviest blow to President Pabre. Perhaps your choice was correct. Actually, after making that call, I began to regret it. President Pabre looked out the window silently. His thick lips moved slightly. He said calmly, "The decision to mobilize the troops was indeed a bit too hasty and impulsive. There are still many Federation citizens who support me. Why would I not have the confidence to wait for the results of the impeachment case?" "Mr. President, I think so too," Du Xiaoqing replied. "I've always thought that a firm will is my greatest strength, but I have to admit, the position of the Federation president does indeed have some kind of magic. It can make people forget what you were like in the beginning, forget that you were once a young lawyer protesting on the streets, forget what you hated the most back then. Even now, I still believe that my actions were not wrong, including mobilizing the troops. It's just that I began to feel a strong disgust towards certain changes. My disgust lies in." Pabre turned around and looked at Du Xiaoqing. He sighed softly and said emotionally, "Every morning when I wake up and look in the mirror, I realize that I've finally become the kind of person I despise and fear." Right at this moment, the heavy door of the Oval Office was quickly pushed open from the outside. Office Director Breen, who was forcing himself to appear calm, hurried in. He glanced at the electronic document in his hand and asked with great difficulty, "Mr. President, are you going to defend yourself on Parliament Hill?" "Why not?" President Pabre took down his dark windbreaker from the hanger and looked at the bedroom upstairs through the ceiling. Then he looked at Du Xiaoqing and said with a smile, "Xiaoqing, take your soldiers and come with me." Du Xiaoqing saluted. President Pabre put on his windbreaker and walked out of the door. His expression was firm and calm, as if he was still the young lawyer who had walked into the Supreme Court for the first time. Back then, the young and poor lawyer did not have the confidence to win the public service lawsuit against a certain giant enterprise, but he was very confident. Rapid footsteps were heard as President Pabre walked down the stairs under the protection of the Special Task Force agents and a certain razor-sharp company of the Iron 7th Division. He followed the secret passage under the official residence to the exit behind the Ministry of Finance building in Charter Square. A convoy had been waiting there for a long time. Underneath the official residence was the Federation Government Processing Center, which occupied a large area. Countless daily affairs in the Sanlin sector were completed here, and the work of contacting countless departments was then handed over to the president for signature. The soft light was like the most gentle sun, shining in the vast underground space. Hundreds of staff in the Government Processing Center looked at the crowd walking by the wall and stood up subconsciously. The expressions on their faces were complicated and gloomy because they knew where the president was going and what he was going to do. Everyone has worked hard. This was not a parting greeting, but a deep voice that had been heard in the Government Processing Center every day for 7 years. No matter how busy President Pabre was in the Oval Office, he would always go underground and greet all the staff before going to bed. Clap, clap. Looking at the back of the president disappearing at the end of the corridor, one of the staff members started to clap. The applause gradually became louder and louder, and the sound of someone crying could be heard. Then they sat down and continued to busy themselves with the opposition members on the phone, even though they knew that it was useless. The presidential convoy left the Ministry of Finance building, went around the Bureau of Proclamation Square, and arrived at the Parliament Hill building. The Capitol Military Police and the Special Task Force agents followed on foot, vigilantly watching the surroundings. The staff who arrived early drew a long cordon at the foot of the Parliament Hill. The Special Task Force agents in black suits pushed away the people who tried to get close. President Pabre looked out of the window in silence. He saw many angry people marching in silent demonstrations and roaring murderers. He saw countless ferocious and angry faces, but he also saw many nervous and anxious faces. Countless people who supported him had also come here. It seems that this government has not completely disappointed the people. The president looked out of the window and waved his hand. He said calmly, At least, I believe that no one can deny that the healthcare reform bill will help the people at the bottom. Du Xiaoqing, who was sitting in the front row, replied, Mr. President, as a soldier of the Federation, I obey orders and respect the charter. But personally, no matter the result of the impeachment case, I think that you have made a lot of good efforts and have done very well. I promise you that if the impeachment case fails and someone tries to do something outside the framework of the charter, the federal forces, and I will make sure that you and the government will be fully implemented. President Pobre smiled and reached out to pat him on the shoulder. On the solemn rostrum of the Parliament Hill, Pobre looked calmly at the packed seats in front of him. His expression was calm, and his voice was still deep and powerful. However, today he was not delivering the annual State of the Union address. Instead, he was defending himself as the impeached president. This defense was very simple, and it might even be the shortest speech he had ever given in his life. There was no emotional refutation in this defense, no sharp loopholes to catch, and it seemed that he did not even bother to provide evidence. You sitting in the seats now, and the people behind you, no one has the right and position to judge me, the President of the Federation. Only history has the right to judge me. President Pobre leaned forward slightly and slowly swept his gaze over the embarrassed members of the parliament. He said calmly, but no matter how history pronounces it, I still insist that I am innocent. The deep and firm voice echoed in the empty Parliament Hill, and then there was a deathly silence. Looking at the dark-faced middle-aged man on the rostrum, who did not have much elegance or nobility, the excited members of the Pobre faction could not help but stand up and return the warmest applause. This was the poorest president in the history of the Federation. A poor lawyer who came from a mining family in Donglin had finally ascended to the throne of power in the Federation. Looking at the face they had loathed for 7 years, and thinking of the fierce battles in front of and behind the scenes, even the opposition members of the parliament could not help but feel endless emotions in their hearts. They subconsciously began to softly clap. After the defense ended, the Parliament Hill entered the most crucial voting session. President Pobre and his government officials left the hall and went to the conference room to wait for the final result. According to the calculations of the subordinate organization of the official residents, there should be at least 40% of the Parliament Hill members who could not lose their votes. However, before the final result of the voting was out, no one dared to say that they would definitely win. The old man on the rostrum of Parliament Hill smiled and nodded to the even older chief judge, who seemed to have fallen asleep beside him. After clearing his throat, he said, "Everyone, the vote for the impeachment bill against President Pablo has officially begun. Before the vote, I want to say a few words. Although we all like money and power, for the sake of the Federation, for the sake of the little sense of responsibility that you may have, when you answer yes or no, please try to only ask your own rationality and emotions." Everyone knew that Deputy Speaker Xian was the closest political partner of Lady Tai in the back mountain of Macho. It was natural for him to make such a statement before the impeachment vote. However, when the vote began, many people were shocked. Senator Sun Yiyu, do you think President Pobre is guilty of the first charge? Yes. Senator Scree, do you think President Pobre is guilty of the second charge? Yes. No. Yes. No. The impeachment vote was going on anxiously and nervously. As several members unexpectedly voted in favor of the impeachment, the hall began to be filled with a strange and depressing atmosphere. The members who did not understand what was going on whispered to each other, with extremely complicated expressions. The people in the Parliament Hill knew the senators, who could be controlled by the 7 major families, and could be swayed by the political forces of each state. However, they did not expect that more than a dozen of the most staunch senators of the Pobre government would also vote in favor of the impeachment. Senator Evo was the daughter of a miner in the Donglin district. She had no background, but everyone knew that she was the staunchest supporter of President Pobre. Regardless of whether it was the Patriot Act or the several bills that increased the president's authority, she voted in favor of them without hesitation. She had even expressed her agreement to change the election law during the private briefing period and supported President Prabal to complete an unprecedented 3 consecutive terms. But today, she chose to support the impeachment of the president. There were many senators like Senator Evo, who changed their minds at the last minute and cast a shocking vote. In the Parliament Hill, the PAC faction originally had the advantage, at least more than a third of the votes. However, at this time, under the sudden continuous attacks, they were losing ground. Whether it was the PAC faction members who voted not guilty, or those who were preparing to vote not guilty, their faces began to turn pale as they looked at the staff counting the votes. The voting process was not even halfway done, but they seemed to have seen the final terrifying result. At this time, many of the senators in the Parliament Hill looked at their colleagues in the front row, or beside them who had changed their minds, and suddenly realized how much power the lady in the back of the mountain had hidden. But what they did not know was that not all of the senators who betrayed the Pobre government at the last minute were the actions of the lady. There were at least a dozen senators who voted according to the will of the Green Dragon Mountain. Director Breen pushed open the door and rushed into the conference room. In the past few days, as the director of the Office of the President's Residence, he had always been in a state of anxiety and panic, but he had always concealed the expression on his face very well. At this moment, he finally could no longer hide his true emotions. Because of nervousness, beads of sweat dripped down his hair and wet his collar. Looking at President Pobre by the window, his expression looked like he was going to cry, but also like he was struggling to squeeze out a smile. He looked very funny and helpless. His lips slightly opened as if he wanted to speak, but his hoarse voice rubbed for a long time, but no sound came out. The conference room was silent. Through Director Breen's expression, the government officials in the room, waiting for the final result, knew that the voting situation was definitely not good. Everyone's expression suddenly changed, and the female advisor of the Campaign Policy Office, who was in charge of the specific work of the impeachment case, directly fainted. The National Security Advisor took out a handkerchief from his pocket with trembling fingers and kept wiping the sweat on his forehead that only existed in his imagination. He kept muttering something to the pot of green plants in front of him, his eyes abnormally empty. The deathly silence lasted for a long time, and no one in the conference room dared to speak. The man standing by the window finally turned around. President Pobre did not have bad habits such as smoking and drinking, and he had a regular daily routine. Although his body was still healthy, and could even be said to be strong in his middle age, at this time, it was so difficult for him to make such a simple turnaround. It was as if one could hear the painful and sour sound of his vertebrae rubbing together. It was like a strong machine that was overloaded and suddenly lost all of its energy source and reason to move forward at a certain point in time. He quietly looked at the officials in the room and did not say anything. He directly walked out of the room with Du Xiaoqing and left Parliament Hill. On the road, let's meet in Santa Fe. The official residence motorcade stopped outside the west gate of Capital University. After President Pobre hung up the phone, he walked out of the special bulletproof car and walked into the small, inconspicuous tavern on the street. This tavern called Santa Fe was not famous. The only thing it had was probably the religious red wine smuggled from Bermuda. With the situation in Capital Special District currently unstable, there were even fewer people who were willing to drink in the tavern to pass the time. The surroundings were quiet. The tavern was next to the west gate of Capital University. Across the street was the first military academy, which was under military control. The silent march demonstration that was extremely orderly had not spread to this area for the time being. However, the Special Task Force agents and officials of the Federation Investigation Bureau had still expanded the security area around the block. The Iron 7th Division's Razor Sharp Company was responsible for the security of the tavern. Although Du Xiaoqing and his Iron 7th Division refused President Pobre's orders at the last moment, he still gave them absolute trust. Perhaps it was because of this demeanor that Mr. President was able to make such a talented person like Du Xiaoqing to follow him in silence. Back then, because of the Shika Pharmaceutical Company's pollution case, I was fired for the first time. At that time, I only had the $200 I borrowed, which was half a month's rent that my wife had been waiting for a long time. But I don't know why, when I saw this tavern, I couldn't help but come in and get drunk. Sitting in a dark corner of the tavern, President Pobre slowly rubbed the surface of the old wine table with his right hand and said calmly, "It was in this tavern that I first met the Tao and my companions in the Trinity Association. In the past few years, sometimes I couldn't help but think that the drunken encounter and argument was probably really the arrangement of fate. The impeachment vote in Parliament Hill was probably coming to an end at this time." President Pobre's dark face showed a very faint sense of frustration. He said, "Those who accept the arrangement of fate are not necessarily favored by fate. I thought that we might fail, but I don't understand why. Could it be that what we did was not right? Why is the government under my leadership full of shady deals and a bunch of incompetent trash, as you once said? Why are people like Julian Barry and Descartes ultimately the fatal reason for our failure? I never understood until I came to this tavern. Only then did I vaguely understand one of the possible reasons for our defeat in this war." Standing by the wine table, Du Xiaoqing was silent, quietly listening. "Last time, I told you that there are too few true idealists in this world, and our cause, even the most basic operation of the government, requires countless people. What can I use to attract them? I can only use official positions and power to attract them, not those empty ideals. And many years ago, those members of the Trinity Association I saw in the tavern were the most outstanding geniuses in the Federation like you. They were all idealists, and they could have become the core of the government, the foundation of the Federation. If I could still have such a group of companions, the course of this story might have been completely different, and the ending of this story might have been completely different." President Pobre looked at the dimly lit tavern, as if he was looking at the faces of those companions he was most familiar with, and said sadly, "It's a pity that they're dead. Too many of my genius companions died under the guns of Shi Qinghai and Su Le. If we really lost our cause, then a large part of the reason was because of the unreasonable assassination of those two young people. But there's no point in talking about this now. I just miss those companions." President Pobre smiled slightly, pointed to a small wine table to his right, and said, "That day, we argued for half an hour in the private room, and very simply decided what to do. Then we came out and continued to drink. I still remember that Byron and I were sitting at this table." Then he pointed in another direction, and said, "Matt was sitting here, and Hu Zhu and a few others were drinking over there. They were rich in Taoism, so they opened 3 bottles of brandy number 1 that day. Later on, we came to this tavern to drink a few times. Although it wasn't a lot, we all sat around the same place. The last time was to celebrate Byron's official entry into the political arena, and since then, we haven't seen each other in public. Speaking of which, at that time, you might have been studying opposite." Du Xiaoqing had studied at the First Military Academy for 4 years, and buried himself in teaching and military regulations all day long, so he had never come to this tavern that changed the history of the Federation. His eyes moved in the direction of Mr. President's finger, and fell on every corner of the tavern, as if he could see those geniuses of the past quietly looking at him under the dim light. "At that time, I was still a student in the 5th year of middle school." He shook his head and replied. President Pobre looked at him calmly, and suddenly said, "Actually, when we first met, I knew that you, Xiaoqing, did agree with our ideals, but the real reason why you were willing to help me was because you agreed with me that the Federation with the 7 great families would never be able to completely destroy the empire. There's a question I've never asked. Why is your hatred for the people of the empire so deep?" Du Xiaoqing was silent for a moment before replying, "Mr. President, please allow me to keep some privacy." President Pobre laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "Perhaps at this moment, I am no longer the president of the Federation. Could it be that you still insist on not telling me?" After confirming that he didn't have the same sentiments and desires as he did, President Pobre smiled and continued, It seems that I have to apologize to you on this matter. I have no way of making the 7 great families disappear from the Federation, and I also have no way of helping you lead the troops into Tianjing Planet. It was unknown what he thought of, but his brows furrowed slightly. He gazed at the specks of snow drifting down outside the window and said calmly, "Before Li Yuangong died, he once told me that the true changes in the Federation will occur internally. I don't know if Counselor Tai Ziyuan will do as he said, and do what he should do." A long time had passed since they had arrived at Parliament Mountain, but Li Jiedu still hadn't appeared. President Pabre sank into a long period of silence. It was unknown whether he was thinking about something, or reminiscing about the past in this tavern, that was extremely meaningful to him. Li Jiedu still hadn't come, but Tai Ziyuan had. After receiving the report from his subordinates, Du Shaoqing glanced at President Pabre. After confirming, he said calmly, "Invite Counselor Feng over." The dust was about to settle, and the war between the rulers and the 7 great families seemed to have ended with the latter's victory. This kind of scene was not rare in history. According to the noble pride and elegance of the 7 great families, the heads of the families generally wouldn't appear at such moments. They would even coldly reject any negotiation terms proposed by the other party. However, the Federation of the 76th year of the constitutional calendar was different from the previous Federation. In this war, the opponents of the 7 great families were more determined, patient, and powerful. Although the impeachment bill was about to be passed in Parliament Mountain, there were still countless Federation soldiers loyal to him. There were also countless important members of the 7 great families locked up in prison. Du Shaoqing was standing behind the president. Therefore, the young Federation counselor, the successor of the leader of the 7 great families, the Tai family, became the most suitable and most sincere negotiation target. Under the escort of the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, Tai Ziyuan slowly walked over from the other side of the wind and snow. His thin body looked like it could collapse at any time. He took out a white silk handkerchief and gently covered his mouth. He walked into the tavern and calmly sat in front of President Pabre. He said tiredly, "Mr. President, I hope you can calmly accept the result of the Parliament's vote." Pabre quietly looked at the young counselor in front of him. After a long time, he suddenly opened his mouth. He didn't answer the question, but seriously praised. "As an old civil servant, I know very well that the assembly movement may seem very simple, but in fact it is very difficult to do it well. And you did very well. It is my honor to be praised by you in this aspect." Tai Ziyuan put down the handkerchief and replied with a smile, "I have read your book." Then back to the original question. After a moment of silence, President Pabre slowly raised his eyebrows and repeated, "You want me to accept the result of the Parliament's vote and quietly leave the official residence?" "Yes." President Pabre sighed with emotion. "If I simply leave like this, the Federation will once again return to the hands of corrupt families and greedy politicians. Wouldn't that be the most boring repetition? Then what have I done in my life? What has the Federation changed because of this? Could it be that the Emperor will never disappear, just change a few clothes?" George Carlin's conversation after the tea party in early autumn. Tai Ziyuan calmly looked at him and slowly replied with a very serious tone, "You can believe that the Federation will definitely change in the future. That Emperor will not always put on a cross-dressing show, because as I said, I have read your book." Hearing this, President Pabre's eyes gradually brightened. He looked at Tai Ziyuan's delicate and slightly pale face, as if he was looking at a good picture. "The impeached president will lose all power. I will be put on trial, and many people who follow me will also be sent to prison by you, to bear the responsibility that they should not bear. Will you still agree to Shaoqing continuing to be the commander of the federal forces?" "I don't believe it at all," Tai Ziyuan said with a calm but firm tone. "For people like Dr. Wei, if they don't go through trial, how will we know whether or not they should bear the responsibility? If Teacher Shaoqing has never been deeply involved in those dirty things, you have to believe that I want him to continue to be the commander of the federal forces more than anyone else, because I know that he is more suitable than anyone else. As for the president, The young senator suddenly closed his mouth slowly, but in his still clear eyes, there was actually a faint smile that could see through people's hearts. Du Xiaoqing, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said in a deep voice, "In order to ensure the safety of the president, the parliament must issue a special pardon, and the successor must sign it, providing a full pardon and even protection to the former president in exchange for the other party to voluntarily hand over the power in their hands, thus avoiding social unrest and even civil war in the Federation." This was not rare in the history of human society, and the most famous case was many years ago when the Tai dynasty handed over equal rights to all the people in exchange for great benefits and a promise to never hold the past accountable. As the descendant of the former royal family, Taizuan was naturally no stranger to this kind of political arrangement. Before he came here to negotiate, he had even thought of an answer, but for such an important promise, even if he was from a noble family, he could not make the decision alone. He made a few calls to the Li family, the Nan family and other families. At the end of the street in the snow, a car was parked calmly. Lin Banshan, who was sitting in the back, picked up the phone, asked a few questions and then nodded. Taizuan hung up the phone, looked back at President Pabre and Du Xiaoqing behind him, and said, "As long as you agree to resign, the Federation's next government and any government in the future will not hold you accountable. But that is not a special pardon. The name of the bill will be an order to provide legal protection to the Federation president and his family who stopped exercising full power. The specific provisions will be sent over later." President Pabre frowned slightly, and after a moment he said, "The key is the opinion of Westwoods." Tai Ziyuan replied concisely, "I will provide enough compensation for Westwoods to give up." This was a political compromise negotiation, hidden behind the scenes of the parliamentary vote, hidden in the shadows of hundreds of thousands of people behind the silent march. The 7 families seemed to have given too much, but in fact, because Du Xiaoqing stood silently behind Pabre alone, they had enough bargaining chips. A sharp chirp sounded on the campus of Capital University. Because it was very far away, it sounded like the cry of a winter bird. But when it fell into the ears of the people inside and outside the tavern, who had a military career, it was an extremely clear gunshot. Then the sound of gunshots rang out again. Although it was not dense, it was obvious that it was getting closer and closer, as if the shooter was approaching the tavern. The Federation Investigation Bureau and Special Task Force agents on the periphery had begun to exchange fire with the invading enemy, and the command system seemed to be affected by some strange interference, becoming extremely slow. Du Xiaoqing walked to the entrance of the tavern and listened to the indirect gunshots from 3 directions behind him. He looked at the empty street, looked at the courtyard wall that was extremely quiet in the wind and snow, and slowly frowned. He waved his hand to signal the Iron 7th Division's razor-sharp company to spread out and set up a defense. In the tavern, President Pabre looked at Tai Ziyuan quietly. Tai Ziyuan shook his head. In the car at the end of the street, Lin Banshan frowned and asked Zhang Xiaohua sitting in the front row, "If it's not our people, then who dares to cause trouble at this time?" For the Federation, which was in the shadow of civil strife, for the Federation, whose frontline troops were suffering a serious blow, and for the Federation, which had been in turmoil for too long, this tavern next to the west gate of Capital University had changed its history. Now it was another very, very important moment. This moment could not be disturbed, could not be interrupted. The scattered gunshots and the tense atmosphere inside and outside the tavern did not seem to affect Tai Ziyuan at all. He stared into President Pabre's eyes and asked in a deep voice, "Mr. President." President Pabre was silent for a moment before he said, "I agree." These 3 simple words were too crucial and too important for the current Federation. At this moment, in those manors and prisons, countless people began to clap and celebrate. Then at this moment a hoarse, tired, but unusually strong voice came from across the street. "I disagree." Hearing this voice, the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division on the street were shocked. They could not imagine how someone could hide from the team's scanning equipment and get so close to the tavern. They quickly raised their guns, and aimed in the direction of the voice. It was the modeled wall of the first military academy. There were traces of time and snow on it. Suddenly, a person jumped off the wall with a whoosh and swept away the remaining snow on the wall with the cold wind. That person moved so quickly that the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division did not have time to aim and fire. They only heard a series of gunshots coming from both sides of the street, especially from the west gate of Capital University. More than 10 men in advanced infantry equipment rushed over with modified sniper rifles. Don't move. Don't move. Don't you fucking move. 7th Division bastards, don't move. Cannon. You fucking cannon of the 17th Division. Put down your guns, you son of a bitch. The members of Team 7 snuck into Capital University through the underground sewers, and then used feints to attract the attention of the Special Task Force on the perimeter. They quietly approached their destination. They were already panting and exhausted from running all the way, but they still believed that they could take control of the situation immediately. However, when they found that they were facing an old acquaintance, an old enemy, an old rival, the razor-sharp company from the Iron 7th Division, they knew that taking control of the situation had become a luxury. Xiong Lingquan pointed the barrel of his gun at the officer in front of him, who was only a lieutenant colonel, and roared, "If you dare move, I'll blow you up. You can fucking try." The commander of the razor-sharp company of the Iron 7th Division roared back. Just like how Team 7 felt at the moment, when the commander realized that these people were all from Team 7, he became more cautious than usual, even though there were many of them on his side. These two groups of soldiers had clashed many times in the open, and in the dark during maneuvers, and on the battlefield. They both knew how powerful each other was, so no one dared to act rashly. In such a tense situation, only the small-eyed man who had jumped down from the wall dared to move. Wearing a tattered sports coat and carrying a heavy military backpack, Sulu walked silently from the wall to the tavern across the street in the wind and snow, just like he did every time he was in battle. The only difference was that he wore a pair of glasses on the bridge of his nose. When he jumped down, Du Xiaoqing, with his sharp eyes, immediately noticed this. He clasped his sunglasses tightly with his right hand behind his back and quickly gave the order to not shoot. The pair of military boots that had run 170 kilometers in the mountains squeaked as they stepped on the thin layer of snow. There was a large hole in the front of the boots, as if they were mocking someone. Su Lu, whose face was covered in blood and dirt, ignored the black muzzles around him. He pulled out a pistol from his waist and loaded it with a click. He walked to the tavern across the street with an expressionless face. Xiong Lingquan and a dozen other team members also approached from both ends of the street. They aimed their TP rifles at the nearby soldiers of the Iron 7th Division, completely ignoring the wounds on their bodies and the blood dripping into the white snow. When he walked past Du Xiaoqing, who was standing at the entrance of the tavern, Sulu paused and looked at him. He reached out his left hand to push his glasses up the bridge of his nose and said, "Thank you." Du Xiaoqing gripped his sunglasses tightly with his right hand and looked at him expressionlessly. Naturally, he wouldn't say nonsense like, "You don't need to be so polite." He coldly asked, "Are these the glasses that Shi Qinghai used?" Sulu replied, "Not those, but they're better than the ones he used. I know your gun is still in the case, so you weren't as fast as me." Du Xiaoqing frowned slightly. He remembered 3 or 4 years ago, when Vice President Byron was blasted into a bloody flower by ACW under the long stone steps of the Parliament Hill. He remembered that the sunlight in Charter Square was quite good that day. He remembered that he smoked a thick cigarette on a couple's chair in the square and watched the handsome smoking young man under the statue of the Group of 5 die, as if he was asleep. So he finally confirmed why Su Lu came at this time, and why he dared to come. 2011. 5:13. 13. 38. Modified version. Chapter 976. Hiding behind a beautiful velvet curtain and making some shady deals and compromises behind the backs of the entire audience? This is probably the legendary insider trading. The people involved in insider trading know very well that their faces are indeed very ugly at that time. So they have to hide in dark corners, such as in this tavern, whispering to each other like thieves, so that no one can hear them, right? But it's really a pity that my hearing is too sharp. Even if there is a thick curtain, even if there is a street between us, I can still hear it so clearly. The loaded military pistol was tightly gripped in his hand, and the heavy military backpack was heavily carried on his shoulders. As he swayed with his footsteps, it hit his back and collided with the bulletproof hard pottery shards in his tattered sports windbreaker, making a clear and crisp sound. After so many things have happened and so many evil deeds have been done, you can just drink a few glasses of wine and chat casually, hand over the position to the other party, and then retire with a smile. With a small manor with nice scenery, you can continue to write a few diary entries to summarize your gains and losses, and then die of old age in bed with a clear conscience? Sulu stopped and looked at the two familiar faces by the table. He looked at the current president of the Federation and the young senator, who was most likely to become the next president of the Federation, and said, "Although this universe has never been reasonable, your idea is too unreasonable. Politics is not about reason." Taizuan raised his head and looked at Su Li's side face tiredly. He frowned slightly and said, "Most of the time, politics is actually all kinds of compromises." Compromises? You should know very well that I have never known how to write those two words. When the Federation wanted to compromise with Medellin, my answer was very simple. And I remember that at that time, Mr. President, you were also unwilling to accept the word compromise. Looking at President Pabre, Sula said, "I remember that in the Nebula Award speech at the George Carlin Art Center, you once said that you have to pay the price for making a mistake, even if you are already dead. You also said that you are a devoted follower of the Federation's law. And if you are dead, people can dig up your grave and see what color it is inside." The tavern was silent for a moment, and then he suddenly heard his voice become sharp and cold. He asked coldly, "Dig up your grave? You haven't even laid in your grave yet. How am I supposed to dig you up?" The simple words were filled with extreme anger and hatred. Sulu used these words to announce to everyone present that President Pabre would never be able to retire gracefully in front of him. In order to see the color of his grave, he would not hesitate to send him to his grave. Taizuan frowned again, looking at the man whom he had not seen for almost 4 years, and thinking about what kind of uncontrollable variables his sudden appearance might bring to the situation of the Federation. His face gradually became grave and solemn. He scolded in a deep voice, "Sulu, stop talking." Sulu turned to look at him and shouted rudely, "Taizuan, shut up." In the car at the end of the street outside the tavern, Lin Banshan heard the fierce argument coming from the tavern in the distance. After confirming that it was Sulu and his Group 7, he couldn't help but shake his head. A moment later, President Pabel's deep voice broke the silence in the tavern. He quietly looked at Sulu, who was sitting beside the table. He looked at that cold and resolute expression that he once admired, but now made him feel extremely dangerous. He faintly asked, "What's the matter?" He said faintly, "If the letter you left behind when you left the Federation is true, and you still think that you are a member of the Federation, and you love the Federation, then I really don't understand. Do you really hate me and my government so much? Even more worthy of your hatred than those rotten and filthy families? In the 7 years that I was in power, the Federation passed the Inheritance Tax Act, the Information Disclosure Act, and the Fund Calculation Act. The Federation government has never been so strong. The 7 families have never been so weak, and the people have never been so proud. Don't always look at the silent demonstration that Senator Nightmare Origin has mobilized. You should also look at what the people who support me are saying. They have better benefits, they have better healthcare plans, and their children can share the fruits of the education reform. Yes, they are still being exploited by the capitalists in those families, but at least now those families won't dare to be as unscrupulous as they were in the past. Who made the Federation change like this? It's me, President Pabre said calmly. If it weren't for me, would the upper-class officials and nobles have given out so many benefits? Would they have taken so many steps back? Su Lu, if you see yourself as a member of the Federation, then you should respect and appreciate my 7 years of hard work. If you are only clinging to some moral views in your heart, then I really want to know what right you, a citizen of the Empire, to meddle in the affairs of the Federation. Faced with Mr. President's sudden anger and questioning, Su Li's eyes narrowed. His right index finger slowly rubbed the metal pattern on the handle of his gun as he replied, "This matter has nothing to do with morality, and it has even less to do with whether I am a citizen of the Federation or a citizen of the Empire. The things that you and Li Jiedu have done, as long as one is a person, they have the right to meddle in it. But the Federation does not need you to meddle in it, because this is the Federation's own business." Tai Ziyuan looked at him and reprimanded in a deep voice, "If you are allowed to continue like this, just to satisfy your pitiful and inferior mental world, and the Federation really falls into a civil war crisis, how many people will die in the chaos? If the people can understand the insider trading you are talking about, I believe that the entire Federation will agree to this compromise. Su Lu, please do not forget your identity. You are a prince of the Empire." Hearing the reprimand of his best friend whom he had not seen for many years, Su Li's mood was a bit strange. His eyebrows that were as thick as ink sabers gradually rose, and the smile on his face was a bit bitter. Licking his dry and bleeding lips, he suddenly smiled and said with narrowed eyes, "Yes, for a prince of the Empire to meddle in the affairs of the Federation, it really is like meddling in other people's business." His voice suddenly became extremely cold and calm. "But you should know very well that meddling in other people's business is the most important hobby of my life. This hobby has been maintained for too many years and can no longer be changed. If it were not for my meddling in other people's business back then, you would have already died in the parking lot. And don't forget that the entire West Woods will listen to what I, a citizen of the Empire, say. So no matter what agreement you reach, as long as I do not express my opinion, it will be meaningless." The West Woods was in a tense state of military confrontation. Everyone knew what kind of influence Su Lu, a prince of the Empire, had on the little princess of the Zhong family. If he insisted on doing something, it was believed that Zhong Huayan would definitely lead the troops of the West Woods to follow closely behind. There was a dead silence around the wine table. Just now I was hiding behind the wall of a courtyard. I did not think about coming out, but I really did not expect that things would develop into this situation. Su Lu looked at Tai Ziyuan, then looked at Du Xiaoqing, who was behind President Pabre. His thick eyebrows that were raised like sabers gradually calmed down, and he said with a self-deprecating and slightly sad smile, "Compromise, compromise, always compromise? Compromise, compromise. Everyone is compromising. And I am the only citizen of the Empire who refuses to compromise? This is indeed ridiculous and absurd. What is going on? Is the world crazy or am I crazy?" There was too much sadness in his plain self-deprecating tone. Su Lu took a deep breath, and his right hand clenched the hard handle of the pistol. The wounds on his body split open, and blood slowly oozed out. His eyes that were staring at Du Xiaoqing became brighter and brighter. At the end of the story, if you still want to play the role of a national scholar and not betray your master, then I'll play with you. I'm here now. You can beat me to death, but I can guarantee that before I die, I will definitely send this shoe-polishing president to his grave. As his eyes became brighter and brighter, his voice became louder and louder. His hoarse voice resounded in the tavern, but it was not impassioned but firm, persistent, and valiant. Not holding anyone responsible after stepping down. The dead waitress in the gymnasium will not agree. The soldiers of the West Woods on the ancient bell will not agree. The dead brothers of Group 7 will not agree. Commander Zhong and his wife will not agree, but they can no longer speak. So I will say on behalf of them, I do not agree. Even if the whole Federation agrees, I still do not agree. Even if the Federation falls into a civil war. Tai Ziyuan stared at him coldly. Su Lu did not look at him, nor did he answer his question. He slammed the pistol that he had been holding for a long time on the small table, and placed it in front of President Pabre. He said in an emotionless voice, A civil war is indeed terrible, but other than compromise, there are actually many ways to end it all, to prevent the Federation from falling into a civil war, and to my satisfaction. Sacrifice yourself. He stared into President Pobre's eyes and said, Mr. President, don't you often ask people to sacrifice themselves for the Federation? Didn't you tell me before that some innocent lives must be sacrificed for a great cause? According to your concept, many people in the Federation have already been sacrificed. So now that a civil war is about to break out, before the danger of separation, why can't you sacrifice yourself for the Federation? Don't say nonsense like the Federation can't do without you, and the righteous cause needs your leadership. There has never been a savior in this world, and the people don't need a savior. You are not, and neither is Tai Ziyuan. No one can be a real savior. President Pobre silently looked at the pistol with a metallic luster on the table for a long time. Then he looked up at Su Lu and asked, Do you want me to die so badly? Su Lu was silent for a moment, and then he smiled and replied, I have always had a feeling that the young master has been lying in the grave looking at me all this time. He killed the vice president of the Federation. If I let the president of the Federation escape, he will definitely laugh at me, and I can't stand being laughed at by him. So yes, since there is no trial, your death is very important to me. Chapter 977. Death or spending the rest of my life in prison? Is this the choice you're giving me? Dying with the whole world, or bravely taking responsibility? For someone who has sacrificed countless times for others, it shouldn't be a difficult choice. I didn't expect you to still believe in law and justice in the Federation. Mr. President, you've never really understood me. Even when I was forced to flee Donglin to the capital ring when I was young, I still believed in the law. It wasn't until I found out that there was a problem with the people enforcing the law that I began to fight my own battles. The slightly warm metal bracelet was in his sleeve, sticking to his wrist. The 2 lines of small words related to the morality of the stars seemed to be deeply imprinted on his skin. If this is the end of the story, I really hope that the naive thoughts of my youth can be properly verified. That's why I insist that you must be tried. If you insist on not accepting, or if you're arrogant enough to say that the results of the trial are not satisfactory to me and those who died, then I will not hesitate to raise my gun. Su Lu stared into President Pobre's eyes and said word by word, I will kill you with 1 shot or 2, or even a random shot. As soon as he finished speaking, a series of gunshots rang out in the distance. The gunshots were some distance away, deep in the campus on both sides. It was probably the Special Task Force, or the Federation Investigation Department's agents, organizing some kind of attack. Because of the chaotic gunshots, the atmosphere between the members of Group 7 and the Iron 7th Division's razor-sharp company suddenly became more tense. Su Lu raised his head and looked out of the tavern. His gaze, which was many times sharper than that of ordinary people, penetrated the tavern's characteristic Bermuda pattern glass window. It was not blocked by the falling snow and landed on a water tower in the campus about 800 or 900 meters away, where he saw the reflection of a scope. There were snipers trying to aim at him, but because the interior of the tavern was too dark, and he was too close to Pobre and Du Shaoqing, the snipers did not shoot for the time being. Su Lu used his empty left hand to hold the frame of his glasses, and adjusted it slightly. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the railing of the water tower, then at the cleaning room of a dormitory. He used a little force on his left wrist, and the muscles vibrated slightly to trigger the red trigger button hidden in his sleeve. Pop, pop, pop. A few muffled but loud gunshots that sounded like spring thunder instantly cut through the snowy sky in the deep winter. The high-speed rotating ACW sniper rifle bullets seemed to have come from the sky and hit a certain spot in the water tower and the dormitory building on the campus with unparalleled accuracy. Cement splattered everywhere, and the iron railings were twisted and broken. A terrible hole was blasted open on the top of the water tower, and thin pieces of ice were violently spurting downwards. The officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division's razor-sharp company were very familiar with this kind of gunfire. Today, When they were traveling from the southern encampment to the capital, they had to travel through the mountainous mountains and villages along the way. It was as if the terrifying gunfire had never stopped. His gaze pierced through the glasses, and the hidden ACWs accurately bombarded the exact same spot. This was the true method of killing with one's gaze. This was the same method that Shi Qinghai used to kill Vice President Byron in front of the entire Federation, when he barged into Parliament Hill alone in front of the Charter Square. The main forces of the Iron 7th Division and the mecha groups did not enter the city. There were still more than 100 people from the Razor Sharp Company guarding the area around the tavern. Coupled with the agents of the Special Task Force and the Federation Investigation Bureau stationed outside the tavern, they were more than enough to suppress or even kill Su Lu and Su Lu, who had somehow managed to sneak into the tavern. However, Du Xiaoqing remained silent and did not say a word. This was because he had noticed the glasses on Su Li's nose from the very beginning and knew that Su Li's threat was very real. Before the people who wanted to compromise killed him, as long as he kept his small bright eyes open, he could kill anyone he wanted to kill with 1 or 2 shots. Like President Pabre. After a short and hurried exchange of information and orders, the gunfire outside the tavern stopped. The agents of the Special Task Force and the Federation Investigation Bureau no longer dared to launch probing attacks. As for the snipers, they all retreated to higher ground to avoid wasting their lives in vain. In a dark corner of the tavern, President Pabre looked at Su Lu and asked with a frown, "You've always been looking for justice, but the question is, what makes you so sure that what you're doing is right?" I've spent too much time and too many words discussing this question with someone in a dark room before. So today we won't be talking about justice. I can only say. After a moment of silence, Su Lu replied, "I can't be sure if what I'm doing is absolutely right. I can only be sure that what you and Li Jiedu did was wrong." He raised his hand and pointed at Tai Ziyuan across the small table and said, "If you're wrong, you have to admit it. If this guy becomes the president in the future, and becomes the second you, I won't let him go." President Pabre frowned slightly and said, "Actually, I've always been a little confused about you. If a normal person is like you, constantly encountering bizarre changes, entanglement, and tribulations in their life, they would have already broken down. At the very least, it would be very difficult for them to believe in certain things so firmly." He looked at Su Li's ordinary face and said with emotion, "But you're so strange. Time and encounters seem to have no effect on you. You're still as determined and persistent as before, as if nothing has changed. The people of the capital ring call us the people of Eastwood Stone, because we are smelly and hard. For a smelly stone like me, perhaps we can't change this world, but I can't let this fucking world change me." Hearing this, President Pabre's equally straight eyebrows slowly creased. His tan cheeks showed a complicated expression. He looked at Su Lu as if he was looking at himself. He murmured softly, as if he was talking to himself, "Have I really been changed by this world?" Under the dim light, around the small table, the deathly silence lasted for a long time. President Pabre seemed to have made a very important decision. His solemn and steady face suddenly exuded a long-lost relaxed expression. He smiled and said, "I agree with your disagreement. When a government document required the president to sign an order, it would sometimes use an electronic fingerprint. Sometimes it would simply be circled and then annotated. Most of the time, it would only say one word. I agree. I agree with your disagreement." Everyone around the table understood this sentence. Standing behind President Pabre, Du Xiaoqing's eyes were at first shocked, then inexplicably gloomy. His face was expressionless. His hands behind his back were clenched so tightly that his veins could be seen. Tai Ziyuan looked at President Pabre across the table in shock. He did not hide his strong puzzlement. He frowned and did not understand. Could someone really be willing to make such a choice? President Pabre slowly stood up. This time, he was not as heavy and tired as he was when he realized the Iron 7th Division had not entered the city, and the situation on Parliament Hill was dire. He appeared exceptionally calm and relaxed. He smiled at the people and said, "Don't forget, I'm also a smelly stone from Donglin. A stone's ending should not be one of escape, but one of pride." "Your choice has won my respect in the end," Sula replied. "The truth can't be hidden forever. The right result obtained through wrong means will eventually become wrong. The government relies on, well, everyone knows these words, and can even recite the various versions. But unfortunately, just because you can understand and recite doesn't mean you can do it." In the Oval Office of the President's official residence, President Pabre held a glass of red wine and looked at the clear scenery outside the window. He hugged his wife in his arms and smiled. At this time the phone rang. Li Jiedu's calm voice sounded from the phone. "Sorry, Mr. President. I had to prepare some things, so I didn't keep the appointment. And I think that now is not the time to reminisce. Reminiscing in small taverns should be something that happens when one is truly old. Everything is over." President Pabre looked at the disappointed and even pained supporters outside the lawn, and said with a little emotion in his calm voice, "Parliament Hill has passed the impeachment proposal." "No, it's not over yet." On the phone, Li Jiedu's voice didn't sound depressed or disappointed. Instead, it sounded unprecedentedly calm and confident. Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division disobeyed the military order, but the 3 key areas in the capital are still under the military's control. We still have a lot of troops to support. I have made all the preparations and a perfect plan. Mr. President, please believe me. Even if we are forced to form a government in exile, we only need half a month to regain control of the order. I'll send troops to pick you up right away. Pabre held the phone and replied calmly after a moment of silence, "I had a dream last night." Do you want to know what the dream was about? There was silence on the other end of the phone. In the dream, I was flying freely in the sky. It was romantic and happy. After landing, countless mobs came roaring. I asked the officer next to me what had happened. The officer told me that in order to fulfill my dream of flying freely anywhere, the people all over the country were driven to set their houses on fire to create a large updraft. Some absurd dreams appeared in President Pabre's mind on the eve of the impeachment and the eve of the implementation of a powerful plan. It could explain a lot of emotions hidden in the depths of his spiritual world. Li Jiedu on the other end of the phone understood what Pabre wanted to say and what kind of attitude he expressed, so his voice became cold. "Mr. President, you have disappointed me. I'm no longer the president. Do you still remember our conversation in the tavern?" Pabre said calmly, "Haven't you noticed that we are gradually becoming the kind of people we loathed and feared in the past?" Li Jiedu didn't answer. After a moment of silence, he directly hung up the phone. Pabre was deep in thought. He slowly drank the red wine in his glass and smiled at his wife, who was looking at him worriedly, saying that he was fine. The heavy door of the Oval Office was pushed open. Mr. Pabre took his wife's hand and walked out of the door. Outside the door, Du Shaoqing and the other Federation soldiers, Xiong Linquan and the other members of Group 7, Taizuan and Lin Banshan, and the representatives of the Judicial Committee of Parliament Hill were all quietly waiting for him. He wasn't the first president of the Federation to be impeached, but he was definitely the most courageous president of the Federation to be impeached. Chapter 978. Salute! Outside the Oval Office, the officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division stood at attention and saluted. Du Shaoqing took off his sunglasses and silently followed behind Mr. Pabre. Xiong Linquan and the other members of Iron 7th Division did not salute. Covered in dust and blood, they held their TP-modified sniper rifles. Being pretentious was never part of this team's temperament. Before confirming that the target had entered the detention center of the Ministry of Justice, they would remain vigilant. Nannies, cooks, cleaners, and all the service staff stood in 2 rows in the corridor. Mr. Pabre extended his broad palm and shook hands with them one by one. He gently expressed his gratitude in a low voice, and then said goodbye to these people who had lived together in the official residence for 7 years. Walking to the front door of the official residence, he whispered to Du Shaoqing behind him, If the other party keeps their promise, you have to seriously deal with the 1st Guard Regiment and the brigades in the garrison area. I think there seems to be a problem with Chairman Li's side. Du Shaoqing nodded. Mr. Prabal held his wife's hand and gently kissed her on the cheek. After that, he turned around and looked at the building that had witnessed the most glorious and darkest moments of his life. Looking at the empty staircase, his eyes couldn't help but turn gloomy. Tap, 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 tap. A hurried sound came from the stairs. Miss Padre rushed down. She ran so fast that her waist-length curly hair was a little loose. She rushed into her father's warm and solid arms. Still not speaking, she just hugged his waist tightly and pressed against his chest. The father and daughter who hadn't spoken or eaten at the same table for 3 years hugged quietly like this. Then Padre pulled his wife in, planted a kiss on the foreheads of the 2 women, and walked out with a smile. When he walked past Tai Ziyuan, the young member, who was most likely the next owner of the official residence, said calmly, "Madam and Miss Padre will be very happy." "Is this a promise?" Mr. Padre asked in return. Tai Ziyuan raised his eyebrows slightly and replied gently, "Yes, but you don't have to thank me." Mr. Padre laughed loudly. His deep voice sounded particularly relaxed. 7 years ago, when you helped me get elected for the first time, I didn't thank you either. I learned a lot from that time, Tai Ziyuan said with a smile. Mr. Padre spread his arms and said with a smile, "And then I used it today." Exactly. The cold wind at the end of the month of the 76th year of the constitutional calendar whistled with snowflakes. Mr. Pabel walked down the stairs and walked towards the bulletproof black car sent by the Ministry of Justice. Beside him were the commissioners sent by the Federal Parliament's Judicial Committee and the Ministry of Justice. Before he was about to get on the car, he seemed to feel someone's gaze on him. He subconsciously looked up and saw Su Lu standing under the eaves of the street opposite the official residence. He was wearing a tattered windbreaker and a hat to cover the fine snow. He couldn't see whether he was wearing glasses or not, and he couldn't see those small eyes that always liked to squint. Mr. Padre's eyes were filled with extremely complex emotions. He silently looked at the person on the other side of the street. In the end, he just smiled, sat in the black car, closed the door, and looked towards the other side of the street. There was already no one there, only the wind and snow. What everyone saw just now was the celebratory scene of the Federation people near the Federation Television Building and Parliament Hill. After Parliament Hill passed the impeachment proposal against President Padre, the Silent March Command announced a temporary victory. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to express their support for Parliament Hill's decision. Supporters of former President Padre gathered near the Federation Library and had a serious conflict with the Veterans Association's demonstration team. According to the latest news, former President Padre announced his unconditional acceptance of Parliament Hill's impeachment resolution. At the same time, he expressed his willingness to accept relevant inquiries. From the video that just came back, we can see that the former president has already sat in the car of the Ministry of Justice. The National Security Advisor, Minister of Finance, and Director of the Medical and Food Administration announced their resignation. The Federation Election Committee issued a notice, according to the relevant provisions of the Constitution, because there has been no by-election for the Vice President of the Federation. The position of President of the Federation will be temporarily replaced by the Deputy Speaker of the Federation Parliament, Mr. Zion, and the presidential election process will begin in the shortest time possible. On the TV screen, a certain male anchor of the Federation News Channel was broadcasting the biggest news of the Federation at an extremely fast speed. Although his professionalism required him to enunciate clearly and speak at an appropriate speed, at this moment, all the viewers could see that he was very emotional at this moment. Parliament Hill's successful impeachment of the president, the Ministry of Justice announced the start of the trial and related charges, and a series of explosive news occupied the content of all the TV channels. As long as you were a member of the Federation, no matter which channel you were on, the broadcast you would see was either the historic moment of Parliament Hill passing the impeachment proposal, or the moment Padre walked out of the official residence. In the elevator of a certain military building, Lee Jae-do, chairman of the Federation's Joint Staff Committee and commander of the 1st Military Region, was watching the broadcast on the TV screen with an unusually calm expression. However, if one looked closely, they would be able to see the anger, disdain, and deep disappointment in the deepest part of this military leader's eyes. When the elevator door opened, General Lee Jae-do took one last look at the scene of Pabre walking out of the official residence on the news screen. He slightly shook his head in an extremely imperceptible manner and walked into the military vehicle in front of him. The crisp sound of a gunshot rang out. The moment the dark green military vehicle drove out of the underground parking lot, it encountered a sudden gunshot. The soldiers of the Federation inside and outside the building shouted in a low voice and spread out with their guns, trying to find or kill the audacious gunman. Inside the dark green military vehicle that stopped, Lee Jae-do glanced at the horrible bullet marks on the bulletproof glass and frowned with some disgust. He said indifferently, "Keep driving." Against the scattered bullets of the long-range sniper rifle, the convoy quickly drove out of the compound and roared into the capital's main street, driving toward a secret military airport in the western suburbs. Coward, hypocrite, coward, loser, cynic, capitulator, naive idealist, childish poor student, lunatic. Inside the dark green bulletproof military vehicle, Lee Jae-do thought of his companion, who left at the most critical moment. His white eyebrows slowly furrowed, and he murmured a series of words in disappointment and sarcasm. "General, in fact, I have always thought that only you can lead such a great cause." A major general with a cold expression on the passenger seat turned around and said, "The president chose to surrender. Perhaps it is to tell you that you can't shirk your responsibility at such a moment. When a group walks on this long and difficult road, some people will fall behind, some people will defect, and any ideological struggle will cause great damage to the cause. So at that time, we must unswervingly support the person at the front to ensure that the team can eventually reach the destination of victory." General Lee Jae-do looked out of the window with an expressionless face. Looking at the snow floating between the winter trees on both sides of the street, he said indifferently, "Now that the person at the front has chosen to give up, then the person at the second position has to take over. What you said makes sense. As a specific part of a great cause, perhaps this is also an opportunity for me to realize myself in life. All 3 plans have been launched." The Major General looked at the screen on the workbench in his hand and reported, "The Western Suburbs Airport is under the 4th sequence of surveillance, and the Harbor City Garrison is under the 6th sequence, so we have decided to leave through Harbor City." He turned around and looked at Lee Jae-do hesitantly and suggested, "General, I understand that we need to stay away from the glory of the charter to complete the plan, but now the Bureau of Proclamation is in chaos. Why don't we choose to take off directly from the Western Suburbs Airport? Everyone who doesn't want me to leave can guess that the Western Suburbs Airport is my destination. What's more, the Bureau of Proclamation is in chaos, but it doesn't mean that the charter computer is also in chaos. And I believe one thing, Tai Ziyuan or Lin Banshan, at least one of them is now in the Bureau of Proclamation." Lee Jae-do said calmly, "Go according to the plan." The convoy of dark green military vehicles had just passed the Western Hills compound when they quickly turned around at the next street corner and drove along Halcyon Avenue to the capital airport. Lee Jae-do has left. Tried to attack to stop, ineffective. The destination may be the Western Suburbs Airport. Wrong. The convoy has turned around. The destination may be adjusted to the capital airport. Jiaozi is making a record in the Western Suburbs. Give up immediately. I have arrived at the civil airport. Lee Jae-do's plane confirmed on the runway distance 3.47 kilometers. Low altitude, 17 Sparrow fighters. Judgment. Taking off from the Western Suburbs Airport, escort formation. Destination unknown. Attention, destination unknown. Enemy planes are taxiing. Second attack attempt in progress. Report suspended. A burst of fierce gunfire came from the communication system. Datsulu stepped on the top of the snow-covered wall and stomped into the soft lawn, supporting his body. Like a shadow, he quickly swept past all kinds of obstacles and passed through the streets and alleys of the capital. He listened to the report in his ears, and his expression was extremely serious. As the strongest supporter of the Papre government, and as the leader of the federal military, Li Jiedu was naturally the most important target. And because of the shadow that was still unclear, Sulu had never let his guard down. Therefore, when the Iron 7 Division and the Iron 7 Division were in danger, he put his most trusted and most capable partner on the other side. He only had one request for Bai Yulan. No matter how badly the Iron 7 Division was fighting, Bai Yulan was not allowed to leave her post. She had to keep an eye on Li Jiedu's movements. After receiving Bai Yulan's first report, he left the presidential residence as quickly as possible. Then, he sat in an unmarked military vehicle on the right side of Charter Square. According to the coordinates in his ear, he kept giving directions to the driver in the major's uniform. The unmarked dark green military vehicle roared through the streets of the capital. Sulu listened to the reports that became more and more frequent until he heard gunshots. His mood became heavier and heavier. He knew that stopping Li Jiedu from leaving had become a very difficult task. Thinking of this, he took out the phone in his pocket and dialed a number. With a hoarse voice he roared angrily, "Lin Banshan, you said you can take care of the Bureau of Proclamation, but I don't care. Then have you taken care of it yet? Find Li Jiedu's coordinates immediately, or just directly shoot him down. If you let him escape, do you know what the fuck will happen?" Chapter 979. In the capital airport, in the relatively remote area children's waiting room, a 5 or 6-year-old boy pointed out the window and curiously tugged at the hem of his mother's clothes. He screamed, "Mom, look over there, there's an uncle shooting a plane. Don't talk nonsense." The mother covered her son's mouth and pulled him into her arms. Then, she looked out of the window curiously. She didn't find the exposed man, who had pulled open his windbreaker. Instead, she saw a delicate man holding a gun in his hand and firing fiercely at a plane that was leaving the runway. This was not an old joke in a vulgar joke collection. It was a real scene that happened in the capital airport at the end of the winter of the 76th year of the constitutional era. Someone was really shooting a plane. Bai Yulan dragged his injured leg and limped forward desperately along the isolation net. The TP sniper rifle in his hand continued to fire bullets. Every time a crisp gunshot rang out, on the hills 200 meters in front of him, elites from the Special Warfare Room, who were responsible for Li Jiedu's safety, fell. Blood flowed down his thighs and dyed his dark green military pants black. The clothes on his body were tattered, and there were even some bulletproof hard pottery pieces that had collapsed. However, he didn't seem to feel anything. He gritted his teeth and stared at the military plane that was gradually accelerating and was about to leave the runway. He kept firing. Bang! Bang! Continuous and dense bullets shot out from the muzzle, tearing through the isolation net, tearing through the cold air of the winter runway, and fiercely hitting the military plane that was moving faster and faster. The high-speed rotating shrapnel carried powerful energy, and occasionally, they were lucky enough to tear off a few pieces of metal. However, the distance was still too far. The power of the sniper rifle in his hand was too small compared to the large military aircraft with armor. Even though he tried his best, disregarding his own life and death, he still couldn't stop the military aircraft from roaring away. Gasping for breath, Bai Yulan struggled to run a few dozen meters in the direction of the military aircraft. She watched as the military aircraft slowly disappeared into the lead gray clouds in the sky. Bai Yulan fell into intense disappointment and self-blame. She angrily threw the heavy sniper rifle in her hands to the ground. Sirens sounded, and more than a dozen police cars drove at high speed from the direction of the terminal. Countless black muzzles were pointed at him, and the loudspeakers kept repeating the same words. Hundreds of meters above the ground, more than a dozen federal military Hawk fighters roared past, silently and indifferently observing the movements on the ground. After confirming that there was no threat, these fighters did not open fire. They rose at high speed, following a beautiful curve and disappearing into the clouds. Bai Yulan, who was surrounded by the military police, raised her hands in surrender. Her eyes were still looking in the direction where Li Jiedu's private jet had disappeared. Her pale face was filled with unwillingness and anger. The Bureau of Proclamation was the most mysterious and important organization in the Federation. However, almost no one knew that the Bureau of Proclamation's defenses against intruders were not as strict and terrifying as the rumors said. Because according to the relevant provisions of the First Charter, the Bureau of Proclamation had the only pre-warning authority. Any object that entered the one-way street, entered the lawn behind the Bureau of Proclamation, or entered the predetermined area around the Bureau of Proclamation would trigger the alarm. This warning system was perfect, like the omnipresent radiance of the stars, ensuring that no one or any sophisticated military equipment entered the area around the Bureau of Proclamation. Therefore, the square building itself did not need to have too much firepower to defend itself. Even the Bureau of Proclamation had an unwritten rule that no firearms were allowed inside the building. This was a rule that was formed when one was too powerful. Like other areas of human society, rules were always the most powerful. However, Lin Banshan, who broke out of the aristocratic family at a young age, had always been the most unruly and the most rule-breaking person. On the street by the west gate of Capital University, after Lin Banshan confirmed that the Federation's major event had been completed, he gathered all his subordinates. They boarded a dozen black cars and drove onto the dead-end road, heading toward the Bureau of Proclamation building at the end of the road. Without any disguise, without any planning, without any clever arrangements, the dozen black cars carried dozens of gangsters in black suits and sunglasses. They openly began to invade the most sacred and inviolable Bureau of Proclamation. There was no alarm, no interception, and no mysterious incident. The arrogant gangster fleet drove through until they arrived at the Bureau of Proclamation building. It was not until the door was violently pushed open that the officials in the hall looked up in shock and discovered that the enemy had arrived. The broken spaceship far away in the asteroid belt had been playing black and white chess with the central computer in the Bureau of Proclamation for the past few days. Because of the silent smoke on the large chessboard, the staff in the hall had been working overtime continuously, anxiously shouting at each other, and constantly performing repair operations. The entire Bureau of Proclamation was in extreme chaos. Chaos could not explain the current situation. The Federation's most secretive Bureau of Proclamation, no matter how chaotic it was, could not become a bathhouse where guests could enter and leave freely. When Lin Banshan's fleet had just driven onto the straight road, there should have been an early warning inside the Bureau of Proclamation. There were no heavy firepower defensive weapons outside the Bureau of Proclamation building, but in a sense, as an organization that had managed human society for tens of thousands of years, it had countless terrifying trump cards. Once the early warning system was activated, the officials in the building only needed to make a very simple response to eliminate all the invading mechanics. It should be known that in the Federation's plan to deal with the surprise attack of the Empire's fleet, the evaluation of the Bureau of Proclamation's defensive power was that it was impossible to break through. For such a mysterious organization that was thought to be impossible to break through, it was undoubtedly very easy to destroy a fleet of more than a dozen black cars. However, the most important problem was that the Bureau of Proclamation's perfect early warning system had failed at this moment. There were internal officials, and even the entire department that had clearly ignored or even secretly destroyed the alarm process. Chaotic and hurried footsteps sounded. Dozens of gangsters in black suits rushed into the hall on the first floor of the Bureau of Proclamation building and quickly occupied all the key positions. The Bureau of Proclamation officials in the hall stood up in shock, not knowing what had happened. Some angrily reprimanded each other, and some female officials screamed and angrily slammed the table. Although they were at a loss, they were not afraid. From the beginning of their life in the Bureau of Proclamation, They did not know what fear was. Lin Banshan, wearing a black windbreaker, slowly walked into the Bureau of Proclamation under the protection of Han Chu and Zhang Xiaohua. His emotionless eyes slowly swept across the faces of all the Bureau of Proclamation officials, as if he was a king who had returned to inspect his territory. The gangsters in the hall were expressionless and extremely cold. Only the curiosity and shock in the depths of their eyes revealed some of their true emotions. Even Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu, who were usually unruly and did not even care about the Federation government, had a nervous and complicated expression on their faces. This was the Bureau of Proclamation that led human society, with its brilliance high above the clouds. How many gangsters in human history had been able to enter the Bureau of Proclamation? In this tense and perplexed moment, something very interesting happened. A gangster in the front right came from Bermuda. He was the leader of the Ink Village gang, who was known for his coldness. But at this time, it was unknown whether he was affected by the tense atmosphere in the Bureau of Proclamation, or because he was proud and shocked that he had the opportunity to be so close to the sacred and solemn the glory of the charter. He held the Black Star pistol in his hand and shouted at an official in front of him, "Who's in charge here? Call him out to talk." After he finished speaking, there was a dead silence in the hall. All the Bureau of Proclamation officials, including the gangsters, looked at this person as if they were looking at an idiot. Even Lin Banshan could not help but frown and look back at him. This was a scene that even the best scriptwriter could not imagine. A group of gangsters from the lowest level of society, as if they were fighting for territory with another gang with machetes and firearms, occupied the most sacred and inviolable Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation. This was like a beggar successfully playing with a princess in the clouds, or a toad jumping out of the well and greedily taking a bite of the white swan. It was ridiculous. Back then, everyone in the Bureau thought that you should stay and take over. You disliked the smell of machinery and the cold electronic synthesis sound. So no matter what we said, you refused to stay. Now why did you bring back these scum of society? Being the underworld emperor is no longer enough to satisfy you. So you want to be the emperor of the charter? A sharp and angry voice came from above the hall. Everyone looked up and saw the director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Cui Zedong, slowly walk out of his office and come to the railing. Cui Zedong looked at the gangsters around the hall below and frowned his white eyebrows in disgust. Then his gaze slowly swept over the hundreds of Charter Bureau officials, especially the few senior officials with calm and indifferent expressions. He said in a cold voice, "I know that many of you, especially you senior department heads, have always thought that he is the most suitable candidate for the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. So you did not hesitate to violate the charter and open up the authority to let this group of scum into the Bureau of Proclamation building." Director Cui Zedong roared angrily. "Do you know what you are doing? Do you feel proud that this group of lowly gangsters turned the sacred Bureau of Proclamation into a shit-like gangster hall?" Lin Banshan looked up with a cold expression and looked at the old friend by the railing, who was much older than before. He said, "The Bureau of Proclamation is sacred because it is independent, so it can be detached. But in the years that you have been the director, how many regulations has the Bureau of Proclamation violated? Don't you know that the Bureau of Proclamation is not allowed to interfere with the internal affairs of the Federation? Have you forgotten that the first chapter of the Bureau of Proclamation training manual says that citizens' privacy regulations must be thoroughly enforced? Don't you know that the Charter prohibits pre-termination of crimes? Tracking and locating the opposition and long-term monitoring of suspects is what the Federation Investigation Bureau should do, not what the Bureau of Proclamation should do. Since you have turned the Bureau of Proclamation into a dog of the Federation government and the military, then what right do you have to respect its sanctity?" Lin Banshan spread out his hands and said expressionlessly, "I was able to complete the most incredible invasion in history with dozens of gangsters at the lowest level of society, something that even the Empire's army couldn't do. Is it ridiculous? In my opinion, it is more ridiculous than a person who ignores the charter and regulations becoming the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. So what? Cui Judong's body trembled slightly. He looked at him in the distance and said in a low voice, "Don't forget that I am still the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. I still have high enough authority. I only need one order, and all of you must die." The Bureau of Proclamation's 5-layer security network. Even if Lin Banshan had controlled the hall, he was only standing on an inconspicuous corner of the iceberg. He was still very far from controlling the organization. Lin Banshan looked at the middle-aged official in the corner and used his eyes to ask. The student, who was his peer at the Bureau of Proclamation, shook his head slightly. He looked at the official in front of him, and then at the floor, indicating that the most important people were still not under control. At this moment, there was a soft sound of brakes outside the door. Then the door was pushed open again. The female Bureau of Proclamation official, who had been extremely angry before, looked at the white-haired thin old man who walked in and shouted in shock, "Director! Director! Director! Why are you back?" Cui Judong knew that the respectful and fearful shouts of his subordinates were not directed at him, because he had called the old man the same way back then. Standing by the railing, he looked at the white-haired old man and felt his legs go weak. He knew that the end might be coming. The person who walked through the door of the Bureau of Proclamation was the retired director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Old Tai. Lin Banshan is right. Letting a person who completely ignores the Constitution be the director of the Bureau of Proclamation is more ridiculous than letting a gang take over the Bureau of Proclamation. The white-haired old man looked around the building that he had served and respected all his life with eyes full of memories. He said with emotion, "The Bureau of Proclamation has too much power, so we have to be more introspective and careful. Back then, I thought your caution was this kind of introspection and careful. Now I know that caution was just forbearance. I was wrong. The Parliament has just decided to let me come back and continue to be the director." There was a burst of enthusiastic cheers in the Bureau of Proclamation Hall. Director Tai frowned and looked at his old subordinates in confusion. He laughed at himself helplessly and said to the people upstairs, "It seems that you really don't have the support of the people. Okay, spread out and do your work. Find Li Jiedu first. He has the authorization, so you can find him. Also, let me remind you, I'm only the temporary director for a few days. After I'm done, I still have to rush back. I don't know if the temporary worker at home will forget to fish out the pickled beans." Director Tai waved to the crowd and then stood up with his hands behind his back. He walked toward the elevator like an old farmer who had just returned from the field. There is information from the Ministry of Defense's General Assembly base. Some military resources have been abnormally consumed in the past few years. All of them have been transported to base 887584. There is a temporary military base in front of the border. A small fleet is stationed there. Because it has just been developed, the Constitution network is not complete. Director Tai sat in the chair in the director's office and looked at the analysis report and data curve on the two-dimensional light screen. He said expressionlessly, "The base has been secretly destroying the network. So many resources, including the 3 batches of ores on the Mohua planet, have all been transported to that base. Now no one knows who wants to do something in that base." Major Zhou Yu, Deputy Director of the 3rd Division of the Ministry of Defense's Strategy Research Center, reported that someone in the military is developing some kind of secret weapon in that base. Director Tai looked at Lin Banshan and smiled. "You know the relationship between that little girl and Su Lu. So this information should be found by Su Lu. The problem is that he didn't say what the secret weapon is. High-power battleship main cannon." Lin Banshan frowned. "Does Li Jiedu want to flatten the capital special district with one shot? According to some of my knowledge, the light energy main cannon needs to greatly increase the coverage area and maintain its lethality. The need for crystal ores is one thing, but the key is that there are many technical hurdles that can't be crossed. I don't believe the Military Science Academy can do it. I don't believe it either." Director Tai coughed lightly, raised his eyebrows and said slowly, "Do you think General Li Jiedu wants to flatten the Bureau of Proclamation? It's difficult to flatten the capital special district, but it's not difficult to flatten the president's residence, Parliament Hill, or even the Bureau of Proclamation. Distance determines accuracy. Lin Banshan shook his head and said, even if he has a battleship that can break through the sparse area of the charter's remote area network, if he wants to aim so accurately, he will definitely be discovered. At this time, the phone in his arms rang. As soon as it was connected, he heard Su Lu roaring angrily on the other end of the phone. Su Lu wants to know where Li Jiedu is. Lin Banshan looked at the old director. Director Tai was silent for a moment, then pointed to a small dot that was moving slowly on the two-dimensional light screen. Lin Banshan said into the phone, his private plane is flying to harbor. Shoot it down. He looked at Director Tai again and calmly said, he asked the Bureau of Proclamation to shoot down Li Jiedu's private plane. This time, the old director was silent for a long time, then replied, the Parliament has the authorization, then shoot him down. 34 seconds later, the Bureau of Proclamation's authorization order was sent to a missile base in South Kizhou. 52 seconds later, the missile base replied that it refused to accept the Bureau of Proclamation's order. Li Jiedu is not Feng Yu. He is the leader of the federal military. Even if Parliament Hill and the interim government deprive him of his position and authority, there are still many officers loyal to him. At least they will not agree to kill him without trial. Lin Banshan looked at the endless snow-covered lawn outside the window. His shoulders seemed to feel some kind of weight. He said slowly, why didn't he leave from Xishan Airport? If it was Xishan Airport, we could directly control all aircraft through the Fourth Order authorization. He suddenly turned around, looked coldly at Cui Zhedong, whose hands were cuffed behind his back, and asked in a deep voice, you even told him the sequence secrets of the Bureau of Proclamation? Even if I didn't tell him, he would still know. Cui Zhedong, with a gloomy expression, laughed at himself, looked at Lin Banshan and said, you don't know how deep Li Jiedu's understanding of the charter is. You may think that you know the charter best outside of the Bureau of Proclamation, but in fact, he knows more than you do. Chapter 980. The dark green military vehicle roared on the streets of the capital. After Su Lu confirmed the situation on Lao Bai's side, he called out to the system, Jiaozi, get a plane. We need to use it immediately. The destination is Hong Kong. Lu Jiao, who was in the dark room of the Western Airport maintenance garage, received the order and crawled into a military fighter with difficulty. He knocked out the two pilots and sat in the cockpit while panting. After repairing the fighter's navigation system that he destroyed as quickly as possible, Lu Jiao wiped the sweat on his forehead and saw a thermal box next to him. He opened it and found that it was full of dumplings. Sorry, he looked at the unconscious pilots and shrugged. He began to prepare for the flight while eating the warm mushroom and shrimp pancakes. When he put the 37th cold dumpling into his mouth and began to chew for the fourth time and was about to swallow, Su Lu got into the cockpit like lightning. He looked at Lu Jiao and said very seriously, take off immediately, trust me. If you can fly to Hong Kong within 40 minutes, you will definitely become a historical hero of the Federation. Lu Jiao, who was pushing the lever forward, heard Su Li's serious pre-battle mobilization and spat out the dumpling. He quickly pulled the dumpling wrapper off his body and said angrily, Boss, it's too difficult for a taxi driver to become a god. At the reserve airport of the Hong Kong garrison area, there is a light feather-class battleship ready to start. Li Jiedu's special plane has arrived and is boarding. Lin Banshan sat in front of the workbench with a cold expression. Through the Bureau of Proclamation's ubiquitous positioning, he monitored Li Jiedu's coordinates and confirmed his current area of activity. Remotely control the battleship's central control computer. Send an order to separate the crystal engine group and cool down. The operation is invalid. An official reported anxiously from the hall. The battleship has entered a complete lockdown. After 3 scans, it failed to capture a stable frequency long-range signal. Lin Banshan frowned. Director Tai, who was looking at the lawn by the window, turned around. Both of them were puzzled as they didn't understand why they couldn't capture the battleship's signal. It was very rare for the Bureau of Proclamation to use remote authority to directly control the Federation's battleships. However, it was even rarer to find that remote control was ineffective. The glory of the charter that spread throughout the Three Woods galaxy could illuminate the world. Only the heavy lead room where the Bureau of Proclamation conducted experiments could become a black zone. However, at this time, the warship anchored at the backup airport of the port city garrison was about to roar. How could it block the long-range signal? That battleship has been modified. All the remote control chips are brand new unmarked chips. There are also some modifications to the hull that even I don't know about. Cui Jiadong, whose hands were cuffed behind his back, looked at the two of them and said with a gloomy expression, "As I said, I know Zhang Che better than you think. No one knows that he is the craziest genius in the world. If we want to stop him, the only way is for Zhang Che to kill him directly." Everyone in the room knew very well that the Federal Central Computer was strictly prohibited from direct physical operations, and it was even more forbidden to communicate with the human chip. The so-called omnipresent demon that could directly kill someone through the chip was just the evil propaganda of the Empire and the anti-science cult in Bermuda. Therefore, everyone was silent. At this time, under the unprecedented pressure of the Bureau of Proclamation, the federal forces at the front line of the Zhuotian galaxy sent back some of the data that old Director Tai was most concerned about. Some of the captured data came from the depths of the Biji Plateau of the Emohua planet. Old Director Tai stared at the seemingly unrelated data on the screen. His two silver-white eyebrows were sometimes lowered and sometimes raised. His expression was very serious. Lin Banshan frowned and asked, "What kind of weapon is being tested under the Biji Plateau? It can actually cause earthquakes and such strong electromagnetic waves?" "Every earthquake is a nuclear explosion," Li Yao said. "What is a nuclear explosion?" Other than the director of the Bureau of Proclamation, even the president is not qualified to know, so you don't need to ask. Old Director Tai looked at Cui Jiadong expressionlessly, as if he was looking at a cold corpse that had already died. A slightly hoarse voice that chilled to the bone was forced out from his old lips. "You even dare to reveal these core things to him?" Cui Jiadong's lips trembled slightly, as if he wanted to explain something, but in the end, he didn't say anything. Old Director Tai's body was bent, as if he was dozens of years older than before. He walked to the corner of the room that was covered by the curtains. He slowly pulled out a hard and heavy metal club from the club barrel that no one had visited for many years. He suddenly turned around and swung it down. With a bang, the metal head of the club fiercely penetrated the skin and muscles and hit the bone. It seemed that in the aftershock of the muffled sound, the clear sound of bone breaking could be heard. Old Director Tai was like an enraged old lion. He kept waving the club in his hand and brutally hit Cui Jiadong's body that was rolling in pain. He roared furiously, "This is the Bureau of Proclamation. You are the director. Who gave you the courage to do a crime prevention? Who gave you the courage to track those people from the 7 great families? Who gave you the courage to violate the charter regulations? Who gave you the courage to even say the most core secrets?" After venting the anger in his heart, old Director Tai panted and threw away the blood-stained club. He didn't even look at Cui Jiadong, whose face was full of broken nose and who was crying in pain. He walked out of the office with Lin Banshan. In front of the light screen in the hall, he asked in a deep voice, "Who is the closest to that warship?" "There are several transfer ships in the direction of Harbor City, but their speed is slow. That warship can block remote commands. We can also block all signals of the warship. Li Jiedu must be aware of this. His plan must be to use the full frequency code to detonate the bomb after the warship enters space and leaves the glory of the charter." Old Director Tai said in a cold voice, "Even if you know, you still have to do it. Order all departments to fully suppress all external communication signals of the warship. Don't let them leak out even a fragment. Tell the technicians, if there is a mistake, I will destroy him before the world is destroyed. Inform all fleets to set off. If anyone in the military disobeys, directly take over their authority. I don't believe that all the warships of the federal forces can block remote control. Inform the Old Moon base to prepare to intercept. If the main artillery base can destroy that warship, then do so directly. No need to ask for permission. Cui Zedong said that Li Jiedu knows the charter very well. Plus the attack on the ancient bell. I think that Li Jiedu must know the distribution of the cracks in the dark zone of the glory of the charter. Then what we need to do now is to completely destroy that warship before it enters the dark zone. Old Director Tai continued to frown. Comprehensively combed through the information of the 3 shipments of Planet Mohua, the direction of the Ministry of National Defense's General Assembly Base, all the details of the 887584 base, trace back to where the bombs were produced, how they were transported, and where they are most likely to be now. The old man suddenly became silent. After a moment, he looked at the officials with a complicated expression and said, "The only thing I can be sure of is that at least one bomb is near the Bureau of Proclamation. It's best to find it." Lin Banshan looked at the old man's rare nervous expression and slightly frowned. "I'll ask those guys to help find it." Inside and outside the Bureau of Proclamation building, it was busy and chaotic. Han Chu and Zhang Xiaohua led their subordinates, and several officials began to nervously search for the possible bomb. They didn't know how big the bomb was or what it looked like, so they could only use the scanning equipment to scan the snow-covered lawn, like an honorary drug sniffer dog. The highest-level officials of the Bureau of Proclamation and the lowest-level gangsters of the Federation joined hands and started to fight side by side at the moment when the Federation was facing a fatal danger. The old Director Tai looked at the green data stream on the screen in front of him and looked at his old partner, who had been with him for decades. His expression was still serious as he murmured, "Old man, you must find out where those bombs are hidden. Everything depends on you." Lin Banshan, who was waiting for the warship interception plan beside the workbench, looked at the old director's thin and hunched back, and finally couldn't suppress the deep doubts in his heart. He whispered, "What exactly is a nuclear explosion? Is it really that scary? Don't mention the word nuclear explosion in front of anyone in the future." Old Director Tai rubbed between his eyebrows and said expressionlessly, "Don't even think about it, or you will die. The calculation results are out." An official reported. Countless clear lines appeared on the screen. They represented the fastest route for the interception plan between the various military bases and the federal fleet. The thickest black line represented the route of the warship on the Harbor City Garrison Base, from S1 to the gap in the dark zone of the glory of the charter. The calculation results were very bad, and no one could be that fast. "Where is Sulu?" Old Director Tai suddenly asked a name. "Can't find him, but he should be on the way to Li Jiedu." A Federation fighter jet took off from the Western military base half an hour ago and is heading to Harbor City. Lin Banshan looked at the screen on the workbench, and after a moment of shock he added, "It flew very fast." Old Director Tai coldly scolded, "Don't say you can't find him, just call him." Bypass the authority of the Ministry of National Defense and remove the lockdown program of all the mechas in the Federation. Take Suli's MXD, Wuxia. Lucio. What a terrible name. Take that little white flower out of the warehouse. Let the Harbor City Garrison Base transfer ship prepare to send Sulu up. Give Sulu a weight limit. Tell that little guy. Give him whatever he wants today. My only request is that he must stop Li Jiedu and that warship. Orders were sent out one after another. Lin Banshan frowned, looked at the old man and said in a low voice, "If the Federation is really in great danger now, you are basically putting the fate of the Federation in the hands of one person." Old Director Tai said, "When Macklin was preparing to escape, the Bureau of Proclamation also put the fate of the Federation in his hands, and he never let us down. Although I have cooperated with him, after all, he is from the Empire." Old Director Tai stared at him and scolded, "Are you not from Bermuda now?" Lin Banshan sighed and shook his head. After a moment of silence, Old Director Tai said, "And what else can we do?" Latest news. The Bureau of Proclamation is trying to intercept Li Jiedu. but the problem is that there is no one to execute it. The fleet and long-range weapons can be controlled, but the Bureau of Proclamation has no way to order the soldiers to shoot at their chairman. If he wants to leave S1, no one dares to stop him. The missile base missed the first opportunity. The main cannons of the Old Moon are mainly aimed at outer space, and long-range weapons are basically out of the question. Even if the Federation fleets are willing to come back, they won't be able to make it in time. So this matter can only be done by you alone. The Bureau of Proclamation has given you temporary authority, so the Federation forces won't attack you for the time being. The mechas have completed their self-checks and are on standby, and a few small transfer ships are waiting for you. The coordinates will be sent over later. In the cockpit of the Federation fighter that was cruising at high speed in the atmosphere of S1, the person on the other end of the phone wasn't Lin Banshan, but Zhou. After a moment, the woman's light voice sounded again. I don't understand why you are risking your life to chase after Li Jiedu. I don't believe that he has a bargaining chip that can threaten the Federation. Sulu, let him go. You don't have to complete every complicated task from morning to night. Sula didn't explain, because he couldn't. Through Philip's calculations, he knew that Li Jiedu might have a trump card. Once that trump card was revealed, it would be extremely terrifying, especially under the premise that this person seemed to have a way to deal with the glory of the Charter. In fact, he didn't even know what that trump card looked like. He only knew that those bad bombs had once caused a civilization that was even more glorious than the current one to disappear into the long river of time. He made his hoarse voice as stable as possible and said, "It's okay, we'll eat in 2 days. Okay, Lingyuan is not bad. Let's go there." The Federation fighter landed with a roar at the large container truck transfer yard to the west of the Harbor City Industrial Park. It slid forward with the roaring sound of the engine. Amidst the noise, Sula shouted to the man beside him, "Jiaozi, you just set a record for human piloting an aircraft. You're a fucking god." Lu Jiao lifted her flying helmet and extended her left thumb to make a proud and confident pose. The container truck transfer yard in the Harbor City Industrial Park was close to the Garrison Reserve Airport. The Federation fighter was still sliding, but the cockpit had already opened. Sula directly jumped down from it. His military boots landed heavily on the ground, and the crack in front of him instantly widened. Looking at the little white flower that was covered in years of dust, but still couldn't hide its cold light. Looking at the bespectacled female engineer, who was instructing her subordinates from the engineering department to do the final inspection, Su Li's eyes narrowed, and he ran faster. He rushed in front of the female engineer, and before he could say anything, he only had time to kiss her forehead that hadn't been washed in days like a dragonfly over the surface of a pond last summer. His footsteps were as fast as lightning. He took off the heavy military backpack on his back and jumped onto the tall little white flower's mecha. He installed the ACW on the left mechanical arm of the mecha, jumped into the cockpit, and pressed the red button with his finger. There was a series of heavy mechanical sounds, and the cockpit of the little white flower's mecha was already in overclocking mode before it even closed. His left hand pushed the control stick forward, and the 2 engines behind the mecha roared. The heavy mecha suddenly shot forward. In the short time before the cockpit door closed, Sula finished changing the magazine of the mecha. He took out the simulation system from his backpack and put it on, completing the connection with the little white flower. In that instant, Sula felt as if he had returned to many years ago. He found the feeling of controlling the little white flower for the first time under the cocky peak of the Old Moon base. That feeling was very good and very powerful. Chapter 982. Shang Qiu stared blankly at the mecha that was sprinting towards the setting sun. She lifted the strands of hair on her forehead as she recalled the feeling of that kiss. She shrugged and thought, even in such a tense moment, he still remembered to kiss me. It seemed that this man had really changed a lot in the years that they had been apart. As she was thinking of this, She didn't know that President Pabre, who had just been impeached in a small tavern in the capital, remarked sentimentally while looking at Su Li's face. "It seems that you haven't changed much over the years." The two different opinions indicated that though time was powerful, it could only change a part of a person's life, and some parts of him couldn't be changed at all. This was probably the reason why Su Lu appeared in the Federation at the moment, and in Harbor Capital, and why he had done such a crazy thing. The Mecha MXD headed toward the huge battleship in the twilight at a high speed. The strong wind blew over the body of the Mecha MXD, blowing away the dust accumulated over the years, exposing the glossy white metallic luster underneath. Then a dark shadow flashed by. The Federation fighter jet piloted by Lu Jiao did not stop, and instead took off again. It whizzed past the air above Little White Flower's mecha, taking the lead to charge towards the gigantic battleship in the distance. The powerful onboard cannons and rocket launchers fired in a dense barrage. The anti-air defense of the military airport of Harbor Capital reacted quickly. The fighter jets guarding the battleship approached at a high speed, forcing the fighter jet piloted by Lu Jiao out of the airspace. However, they succeeded in delaying the takeoff of the battleship, even though it was only for a moment. In the meantime, they had bought enough time for Little White Flower's mecha to approach the huge battleship. Puff, puff, puff. Little White Flower's mecha was dashing at a high speed. Its left mechanical arm was pointed at the huge battleship in the twilight. It started firing fiercely when it was still 2 miles away from the battleship. The sound produced by the sniper bullet on the tail of the tungsten alloy gun was rather dull, sounding like the sound of a heavy ancient war drum. The Scorching Sun battleship, named the Scorching Sun battleship, was the lightest and fastest main battleship in the fleet of the Federation, and it required the least amount of time to take off and land from the ground. The interior of the battleship had 7 levels, but it was still a huge object for the Mecha MXD. A large number of metal flower holes appeared on the protective board of the Scorching Sun battleship under the bombardment of the ACW. However, these metal flower holes were so small that they were almost invisible in comparison to the large body of the battleship. The Scorching Sun battleship was not affected in any way. Like a wild ox that had been bitten by a mosquito, the Scorching Sun battleship didn't feel the gunshot and ignored the white mecha dashing toward it. The blue flames on the engine under the battleship suddenly lit up. The entire Earth seemed to be quaking under the effect of the powerful driving force, and the huge battleship took off slowly. Little White Flower's mecha rushed to the bottom of the battleship like a storm, quickly completing an unbelievably high-speed squat movement. In the middle section of its 2 thick mechanical legs, the multi-beam composite hydraulic tubes screeched as the heavy body of the mecha suddenly bounced up, bouncing towards the battleship that was taking off. The sharp and sturdy alloy blade of the mecha sliced through the battleship like tofu. However, it was still unable to cause any serious damage, nor could it stop the battleship from slowly rising into the air, flying off into outer space under the sunset glow. In the Grand Hall of the Bureau of Proclamation, Director Tai stared at the image of the Scorching Sun battleship taking off on the light screen with a grave expression. "Why hasn't the transfer battleship taken off yet?" he demanded icily. An official by his side replied while wiping the sweat off his forehead. "It's because Su Lu is on the transfer battleship." "Where is he then?" pressed Lin Banshan with furrowed brows. The official raised his trembling arm and pointed at an inconspicuous corner on the light screen, saying in a trembling voice, "It seems that he is on the Scorching Sun battleship at the moment." The multiple images captured by the monitoring system of the garrison and the military satellites were combined into a clear image of the scene in the Grand Hall of the Bureau of Proclamation. As the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation adjusted the focus of the image quickly zoomed in on a spot on the lower right side of the Scorching Sun battleship, where a small dot could be vaguely seen. The camera zoomed in at a high speed, and the image was enlarged and enlarged. The people in the Grand Hall of the Bureau of Proclamation could finally see that the small dot was actually a white mecha. The alloy blade on the front end of the right mechanical arm of the white mecha was inserted deeply into the outer shell of the battleship. The heavy body of the mecha hung on a spot on the lower right side of the Scorching Sun battleship, slapping the hard outer wall of the battleship, along with the violent vibration of the battleship taking off. Though it was soundless, the people seemed to be able to hear the thudding sounds every time the body slapped. It was impossible to prevent the Scorching Sun battleship from taking off. As time elapsed, the battleship took off at a faster speed, and the friction between the body of the battleship and the atmosphere increased abruptly. The outer paint of the white mecha, which was swaying dangerously, could be vaguely seen on the surface of the dangerously swaying white mecha. The suppressed surprise cries could be heard in the grand hall. Only those who had witnessed this scene with their own eyes would be able to feel how small and helpless that white MXD mecha was compared to the massive battleship. Only then would they be able to understand how brave, or perhaps insane, the person operating the mecha was. Lin Banshan looked at the scene with furrowed brows. After a moment of silence, he remarked, "Even if it's a movie, the male lead would climb on a car. Who would use a mecha to climb on a battleship?" The Bureau of Proclamation had calculated in the shortest time possible that the body of the mecha MXD wouldn't be burned by the strong friction in the atmosphere, even though the surface of the mecha MXD hadn't been coated with a special anti-erosion material. The problem was that the life support system of the mecha would be damaged by the high temperature, which would pose a great danger to the pilot after the battleship entered the space. "Give him the best plan for the life support system," said Director Tai. The outer shell of the Scorching Sun battleship was obviously modified in a strange way. The outer shell wasn't made of the indestructible alloy of the battleship, but a composite structure of polymer plastic and alloy. The longitudinal strength of this structure wasn't high, but the internal tension was high enough. After the alloy blade pierced into the composite material, it was squeezed tightly and firmly. The little white flower mecha hanging outside the battleship amid the whistling wind didn't look as dangerous as it seemed. In the next moment, the alloy finger of the left mechanical arm of the little white flower mecha pierced into the battleship, making it more stable. All the monitoring systems of the little white flower mecha, such as the SCC Global Monitoring System, the Large Radius High Sensitivity Radar, and the Auxiliary Infrared Detector, were turned off. Sula saw the peculiar scenes that looked like flowing flames through the sturdiest optical window, and sensed the violent quakes in all directions. He knew that he was flying toward the outside of the atmosphere, along with the huge battleship, and that the coating of the mecha close to him was melting due to the friction in the atmosphere. The mecha could be destroyed at any moment. However, Jingjiu didn't show any emotion on his face. Through the only way to contact the outside world, he said softly to the dilapidated spaceship in the distant asteroid belt, "Little Fei, the bad bomb you mentioned is about to explode. I'm trying to stop it." A moment later, Jingjiu heard Philip's sharp voice, "Where are you? Let me do it." "I'm outside a battleship right now. I'm guessing that this battleship definitely has one. As for where the other bombs are placed in the Federation, I'm not sure. But Li Jiedu definitely has a way to control them. I'm going to kill him. If possible, I hope you can come with me." At this time, Philip had completed his calculations. After a moment of silence, he said, "If the other is going to enter the dark zone, I won't be able to make it in time. The asteroid belt is too far away from S1. Even if you told me 2 hours in advance, I still wouldn't make it. Lele, I wish you good luck. I'll be cheering for you from afar." Sulu paused for a moment before replying with a smile. "I was just being polite when I invited you to participate in this grand undertaking. You really aren't polite at all. Speaking of which, why aren't you ashamed to the point of death?" The communication was suddenly cut off. He looked at the window and saw that the flowing flames were no longer there. He knew that the battleship had already brought the mecha he was in into the thin ionosphere. He took a deep breath of the stuffy air in the cockpit and restarted the life support system that he had manually stopped earlier. He lowered his breathing rate and closed his eyes to wait, feeling the remaining warmth of the high temperature that in the depths of the distant asteroid belt A tattered black spaceship was adjusting its attitude with difficulty. It completely ignored the dangerous asteroids around it, and forcibly turned around, then rushed out of the asteroid belt at high speed. Biderman stared at the giant asteroids that almost brushed past him. He felt the occasional collision at the back of the spaceship, and his already pale face became even paler. He muttered, "The walls of the spaceship are broken. You don't need air to breathe, but I can't." That slender mechanical arm danced at high speed in the central control room. It was like a middle-aged security chief who was anxiously spinning around in circles, but couldn't urinate. Its sharp and angry voice echoed endlessly. "Scrap metal. Scrap metal. You didn't even keep an eye on this kind of thing. The Federation has raised idiots like you for tens of thousands of years, and you're actually not fucking useful at all." The giant chessboard on the screen had already collapsed. The black and white chess pieces turned into specks of light and disappeared. There was no reason to continue the war between the two mechanical intelligences. "Calling scrap metal. Calling scrap metal. Hurry up and shoot that battleship down. If you can't do it, just slit the throat of that crazy General Lee J-Do." Philip kept on giving warnings to that distant blue icy planet. "The charter computer has cut off all communication with you. As such, it can't hear you no matter how loud you shout." Biderman reminded him. "Even if it can hear you, it can't do anything physically, let alone kill you through the two-way communication through the chip. Remember, it is not you. It doesn't have self-awareness and true intelligence. It has only the cold rules in its world." A moment later, Biderman said solemnly while rubbing his hair that looked like dried grass, "And even if the central computer can do this, it won't be able to stop Lee J-Do from acting crazily. I know this person, and I know that he has a formidable understanding of the charter computer." The Scorching Sun battleship broke through the atmosphere and passed through the route between the old moon and the new moon, heading toward the pale permanent star in the distance. As it entered the large space of the universe, the huge battleship looked like an inconspicuous flying machine. The interior of the battleship was divided into 7 levels, with nearly 1,000 crew members. Numerous MX mechas were parked in the passageways from the 2nd level to the 5th level of the battleship. Countless elite soldiers of the Special Forces with small eyes were waiting for orders silently, their expressions nervous and excited. The front of the 1st level was the control hall of the battleship. The control hall, of about 700 square meters, was in the shape of a semicircle. Dozens of officers were busy traveling back and forth in front of the control light screen, calculating the data and confirming the route to complete the secret missions assigned by their superiors. Reporting. The calibration of the artificial physical ruler has been completed. There is no deviation in the route. The signal of the Scorching Sun battleship has been completely blocked. The test overflow signal is ineffective. The enemy has intercepted it perfectly. Lee J-Do stood up slowly from the captain's seat in the control hall and took the cup of coffee from the secretary. He thanked the secretary with a faint smile and walked toward the observation window. The report from his subordinates confirmed that the Bureau of Proclamation had blocked all the outward signals of the Scorching Sun battleship. This didn't make Jing Jiu feel nervous. It was because this was all within his plan. In the history of the human society, countless people had tried to find a way to block the signal of the glory of the Charter. During the first secret meeting of the Trinity Association, Lee J-Do had made use of Cui Jidong's suggestion and made an attempt. After that, Lee J-Do had been mulling over it in silence until today. Except for the observation window in which he was gazing, the entire body of the Scorching Sun battleship and the portholes were covered by a kind of composite board. This kind of board was made of a polymer material and 3 layers of manganese-potassium alloy. It was used to cover the portholes of the spaceship during the space travel, helping the spaceship pass through the torsional holes, full of electromagnetic storms and violent radiation. Even though the Scorching Sun battleship had no need to pass through the torsional holes, it was still equipped with this kind of composite board. Not only the portholes, but the entire body of the battleship was also equipped with this kind of composite board. When the spaceship passed through the torsional holes, The purpose of the composite board made of a polymer material and 3 layers of manganese-potassium alloy was to resist the chaotic and violent electromagnetic radiation. Since it could completely block the electromagnetic radiation, would it be able to completely block the glory of the charter, which was composed of pulses and electric waves? The answer was yes. It was a seemingly simple yet ingenious idea to connect passing through the torsional holes with resisting the glory of the charter. As the first human in history to come up with such an idea and turn it into a reality, Lee Jae-do walked to the observation window and smiled while looking at the deformed permanent star in the distance. The signal of the battleship was blocked by the glory of the charter, so it couldn't detonate the nuclear bombs hidden in the shadows. However, as long as the battleship maintained its route and entered the secret crack of the glory of the charter before being intercepted by the Federation, the scorching sun battleship would become a natural sun by then. A major general of the Federation walked into the control hall and stood at attention in front of Jingjiu. After giving him a standard military salute, he asked in a hushed voice, "General, do we need to make a final announcement?" Lee Jae-do shook his head and said calmly, "No need." The major general said anxiously, "Colonel Li Feng is on the front line of the Emohua planet. He might be affected by the explosion." After a moment of silence, Lee Jae-do said to the people in the control hall in a slightly higher voice, "I think you are all aware that what we are doing will be called an unprecedented terrorist attack in history." The soldiers in the control hall lifted their heads in tandem, regardless of whether they were busy or waiting for orders. People like us will be considered as unforgivable terrorists. Lee Jae-do continued calmly while looking at the faces of his subordinates. "But we still chose this path. Why? It's because we know that this is the only correct path for the Federation. For the sake of the correct path, we didn't hesitate to sacrifice our reputation as soldiers, to bear the infamy of the ages, and to put our family members in turmoil and even danger." Lee Jae-do turned to that major general and said sternly, "Tell me, what right do I have to care about Li Feng and put everybody in unnecessary danger?" The soldiers in the control hall applauded enthusiastically, their faces full of excitement. The soldiers on the lower floor of the battleship waved their fists excitedly after hearing what was said through the system. Looking at his subordinates who were extremely loyal to him, looking at these fanatical soldiers, and thinking of the many comrades in the base, Lee Jae-do was suddenly moved. He took a light breath, and his chest puffed up slightly. He felt that his body, which was not very strong, was filled with some kind of power. After nearly 4 or even 40 years of secret planning and careful preparation, hiding in the shadow of his father's towering peak, he finally had the power to change the world and history. He had those terrifying nuclear bombs that made him sigh with admiration. "I also came from Mount Feicheng with many nuclear bombs. I gave one to the Bureau of Proclamation, one to Huai Chaoshi, and one to Lady Tai. This was probably the most perfect arrangement. After today, the universe will tremble in fear because of my name. The history of mankind will be changed in my hands. I have the most terrifying weapon in the history of mankind in my hands. I will first destroy the Constitution, then intimidate the Federation, and finally conquer the Empire. What else can I do after that?" Lee Jae-do smiled and thought calmly that it was not dark in the universe under the tranquil glow of the permanent star. The front half of the scorching sun battleship was very bright, but the rear half of the battleship was relatively dim. The Mecha MXD hovered alone under the huge battleship, which was scorched by the high temperature and had no trace of its original white color. The sharp alloy knife could pierce through the polymer material and the plates made of potassium manganese alloy, but it couldn't pierce through the thick and hard outer wall of the battleship. The Mecha MXD waved the alloy knife as fast as lightning after stabilizing the body of the battleship, and cut off the plates on the outer maintenance platform of the battleship in a very short time. The maintenance arm extended from the left side of the battleship and opened the connecting valve beside the maintenance door noiselessly. The front end of the maintenance arm was performing a precise operation in a small area. A dozen seconds later, The maintenance door opened slowly, along with a white unsealed and stabilized air. The scorched Mecha MXD walked into the interior of the battleship from the maintenance platform, without turning his head. The heavy and sturdy right mechanical arm struck the side of the battleship, causing electric sparks to fly in all directions. The main electronic switch responsible for opening the valve was destroyed, and the maintenance door leading to the outside of the battleship couldn't be closed anymore. Warning! An enemy has intruded the battleship along the number 656 maintenance platform. Warning! The intruder is a Mecha MXD. He is currently in Area 895C on the 6th floor. Warning! A sharp warning suddenly rang out in the interior of the Scorching Sun battleship. The cold female electronic voice transmitted the information back to the control hall quickly and calmly. The officers in the control hall got up in astonishment and looked at the Mecha MXD, which was scorched all over and looked like a demon god in the abyss, launching a surprise attack at a high speed. Looking at the mecha on the light screen, Lee Jae-do seemed to see Su Lee's iconic small eyes in the cockpit. He didn't expect the other party to pursue the battleship all the way to the space. Jing Jio furrowed his brows slightly and signaled for the relevant departments of the battleship to take action and destroy the damaged mecha in the shortest time possible. Then, he ordered the officer in charge of the operation of the battleship, start the engines at full speed and enter the bright and dark area ahead of time. Then, move to the back of the permanent star along the gap. The scorched Mecha MXD turned into a flash of mottled light and passed through the deep and gloomy equipment tunnel of the battleship. Then it kicked the waist of the black Mecha MX that had rushed out of the gate. The violent force of the kick and the hard alloy foot broke the balance meter under the black Mecha MX's armor. The pilot in the cockpit passed out because of the impact. The black Mecha MXD fell down powerlessly. The scorched Mecha MXD didn't suffer any additional damage. It brushed past the pilot's body and continued moving forward at a high speed. Whoosh! The sharp alloy blade reached out from the right mechanical arm and stabbed out from the bottom of the Mecha MX at lightning speed. Crack! The head of the second black Mecha MX was cut off. Immediately after, the charred black MXD mechanical arm struck out with its elbow, accurately smashing into an MX mecha on the right rear that was preparing to launch a sneak attack. The immense force behind the mechanical arm's elbow directly caused the cockpit door to deform and sink in with a loud muffled bang, sparks flying in all directions. 3 black Mecha MX military mechas slowly fell down beside Little White Flower, who was no longer white. 3 more black Mecha MX appeared about 400 meters in front of the spacious tunnel. 2 more black Mecha MX rushed out from the left corner that led to the upper level of the battleship. Pew. The ACW on the left mechanical arm of the Mecha MXD opened fire fiercely into the distance. The high-speed rotating bullets hit the 3 Mecha MX consecutively. In the dimly lit cockpit, Sulu turned the control stick with an expressionless face. His body shook slightly as he controlled Little White Flower to retreat abruptly in the tunnel that was difficult to avoid, avoiding the 2 bright blades in front of him. The heavy, scorched Mecha MXD suddenly trembled violently. Its thick mechanical legs moved at high speed and seemed to leave behind a series of afterimages. In an instant, it rushed in front of the 2 enemy mecha, evading diagonally punching. The front mechanical leg squatted down, and the alloy blade stabbed diagonally. The 2 black Mecha MX were destroyed instantly. The Mecha MXD operated by Su Le seemed to be scorched black and tattered, but it didn't perform any sharp maneuvers such as leaping into the air. One of its mechanical legs was always in close contact with the ground, and it didn't perform any fancy maneuvers. All it did was simply evading and attacking in a steady and cold manner. However, none of the Mecha MX could resist those simple maneuvers. The ACW of the left mechanical arm shot forward from time to time, and the alloy blade of the right mechanical arm flashed intermittently. The scorched Mecha MXD moved forward and backward sometimes, but it didn't stop moving forward under the accompaniment of the powerful roaring of the 2 engines. Nobody could stop it. The pilots of the Federation on the Scorching Sun battleship didn't back off under such a terrifying and lethal pressure. They operated countless Mecha MX in a frenzy, ignoring the collapsing mecha in front of them and charging forward fearlessly. Since the enemies were not afraid of death, he had no choice but to let them die. This was Su Li's only creed on the battlefield, and also his most direct response to the difficult situation when operating the mecha. The black Mecha MX were knocked away, flattened, or pierced through one after another. They flew up like lifeless rocks and pieces of wood, bumping into the alloy walls on both sides. Then they fell to the ground heavily, right under the feet of the scorched Mecha MXD, that looked like a demonic god. The scorched Mecha MXD moved forward silently. Peach miasma could cut off happiness, or it could be happy. It could be like a small white flower blooming peacefully on a branch. There were 3 most powerful mecha, and 3 most powerful people in the universe. When those 2 people and the 2 mecha were not around, the small white flower Mecha MXD operated by Su Li was the most powerful walking weapon in the world. When he decided to risk his life and launched the most violent surprise attack, no mecha would be a match for him. The small white flower in such a frenzied state was very formidable. If he didn't feel tired, if the small white flower didn't wear out, or if the small white flower didn't run out of energy, he would be able to operate the mecha to charge from the 6th floor of the battleship to the hall on the uppermost floor. However, Su Li was a human being, not a god. He would feel tired and hungry. No matter how abundant the Jinqi in his body was, it would run out eventually. Though the small white flower was powerful, it was made up of countless metal components, so it would feel tired and worn out eventually. By the time the scorched Mecha MX stopped its heavy mechanical legs for the first time, it had already arrived at the 3rd floor of the Scorching Sun battleship. It had broken through 2 layers of defense in succession. Behind the scorched Mecha MXT, countless black Mecha MX were lying on the ground. Most of the mecha weren't destroyed, but they had lost the ability to fight. The heavy Mecha MX tried in vain to stand up by supporting themselves against the wall, but they fell down heavily on the ground. The broken Mecha MX piled on top of each other, filling up the narrow passageway. It was a horrifying and spectacular scene. In front of the charred MXD, there were more than 10 black MX mechas. However, these mechas no longer had the courage of their companions from before. The pilots in the cockpit looked at this unbelievable scene in front of them and stared at the charred black mecha that stood there silently, not daring to move forward. In the dim cockpit, Su Li shifted his gaze from the dozen mecha in front of him to the main light screen. Seeing the 2 cloud values of CLK and CLS that had broken through the peak, he knew that the Mecha MX's load-bearing capacity had reached an extreme state, and the overall damage assessment was very dangerous. The bullets of the ACW were almost used up. What made his body feel cold was that the Mecha MX of the small white flower had been in overclocking mode since they were in port. It had been overclocked for a long time, and the engine could stop at any moment. What should he do if that happened? It's tiring. I'm all alone, but I still can't do it. Jingjio wiped off the beads of sweat dripping down from his eyelashes. He took a deep breath with a gloomy smile. His narrowed eyes grew brighter and brighter. The scorched Mecha MXD raised its left mechanical arm slowly. The dozen black Mecha MX in front of it dodged in a panic, but they bumped into each other due to the limited space. The ACW opened fire fiercely, but it wasn't aimed at those mecha, but at the outer wall of the battleship on the right. The high-speed rotating bullets bombarded the outer wall of the battleship. The outer wall of the battleship couldn't be penetrated, and the ACW was finally destroyed due to the overheating, due to the continuous air attacks. Su Li furrowed his brows in the cockpit, regretting that he had paid too much attention to the concept of close combat when designing the Mecha MX series, which resulted in the lack of long-range firepower. It was evident that the mecha group on the Scorching Sun battleship was equipped with the latest MX models. They didn't even have the standard Darlin machine gun. Su Li couldn't do it even if he wanted to use the long-range firepower of the broken mecha on the ground to blast open the outer gate of the battleship. Since he couldn't get the guns, he could only get the mecha. The twin engines suddenly roared again, and the vortex charging system was activated. Under the bewildered gazes of the dozen Mecha MX, the scorched Mecha MXD grabbed the right mechanical leg of a broken Mecha MX under its feet and lifted the heavy mecha up. Then it swung the heavy mecha and smashed it against the wall. Boom, boom, boom. The scorched Mecha MXD looked like a stone statue in ancient times. It lifted a heavy mecha about the same size as itself and smashed it against the outer wall of the battleship mechanically and silently, as if it were lifting a heavy hammer. It smashed the Mecha MXD repeatedly and forcefully, as if it intended to create the most brilliant fireworks. The dozen black Mecha MX in front of the battleship stood still on the same spot. Looking at the crazy actions of the enemy, they didn't dare attack, but they didn't dare retreat either. In the end, one of the Mecha MXD reacted and retreated at a high speed. The scorched Mecha MXD intended to smash a large hole in the battleship and perish together with the battleship. Regardless of whether it could succeed or not, its insane willpower was truly terrifying. The heavy military mecha smashed heavily against the hard alloy outer wall of the battleship. The outer wall began to deform, arching and tearing apart. With each collision, a dull sound reverberated throughout every corner of the battleship. It sounded like the sound of a giant bell. In the hall on the top floor of the battleship, General Li Jiedu and his subordinates gazed into the distance with a complicated expression. Listening to the dull sound of the collision, no one knew if anyone would think of it. If this was the death knell, then for whom would the death knell tolled? The outer wall of the battleship was pierced through, revealing the beautiful starry sky outside. Then, in just an instant, the huge pressure difference between the inside and outside of the battleship engulfed the interior. Countless streams of air whizzed out of the hole. The scorched Mecha MXD stood in the blowing wind, not swaying at all. The alloy hand at the front of the right mechanical arm released, and the mecha that was about to become a pile of scrap metal fell to the ground with a thud. Detecting a loss of pressure, the battleship's main control system automatically alerted them. In an extremely short amount of time, shielding measures in the relevant areas were activated, and the heavy alloy door began to slowly close. Before the door in front of them closed, the Mecha MXD's engine roared, and it rushed over like lightning. Then, with a crisp self-check sound, the shutdown sequence was completed. Just as the CLK value of the Mecha MXD was about to explode, Su Lu completed the automatic shutdown of the mecha as quickly as possible to avoid a passive explosion. The cockpit door slowly opened. Su Lu removed the simulation system from his body, put on the tattered and blood-stained sports coat again, and jumped down. When his pair of military boots that could no longer be called shoes landed heavily on the ground, the heavy alloy door behind him had just closed completely. He had run out of bullets, the ACW was destroyed, and the pistol was placed on the table in the bar. Su Lu pulled out a sharp military knife from his boots, held it in his hand, and walked quickly towards the end of the corridor. He walked towards the front. With a light bang, a thick blue arc of electricity shot out from the end of the military knife, accurately hitting a small-eyed elite who was preparing to launch a sneak attack behind the door. This elite from the Philadelphia Cultivation Gym didn't even have time to react before his whole body twitched and fell to the ground. His left hand blocked a sharp kick, and his right hand stabbed out with the military knife diagonally, stabbing the thigh of another small-eyed elite, and then quickly pulled it out. Sula didn't even look at the opponent who was bleeding profusely, and continued to move forward. The sharp tip of the military knife cut through the air, following the opponent's fist, and suddenly there was a thin red line on the opponent's wrist. Su Li's left finger stretched out like lightning, and the tip of his finger grasped the separated flesh, while the military knife in his right hand swung out and cut the opponent's carotid artery. The broken military boots stepped firmly on the ground. Su Lu blocked with his left hand, and the military knife in his right hand stabbed into the enemy's body at a seemingly simple angle, but in fact, it was very sharp, and then quickly pulled it out. The sound of stabbing could be heard from time to time in the dark corridor. As he moved forward, people around him fell down from time to time, and blood spurted out all the way. He didn't have a mech nor a gun, only a military knife. But he still continued to move forward. He waved the sharp military knife in his hand and blocked with his seemingly slow but effective left hand. Because he wanted to save his stamina, he rarely chose to cross his leg and hit the knee of the enemy. He just silently dragged his tired body to assassinate the seemingly endless enemies. Only when gunshots rang out would he extravagantly dodge at high speed, and sometimes even use the hard ceramic bulletproof vest under his sports windbreaker to block the bullets. His movements didn't slow down, because slow meant danger or even death. But he could clearly feel that the 10 postures that he had practiced since he was a child were now becoming more and more stiff. He monotonously repeated the stabbing and blocking movements, knocking down everyone in front of him, as if he had become a machine without any feelings. Uncle once said that humans were the first order of machines. The current Sula might really be able to prove this mysterious statement, but even a machine would feel tired. He ran 170 kilometers in the mountains, fought against the Iron 7th Division for half a day with the ACW, broke into the pub to force the Federation president to accept a trial, ran to the western suburbs, flew to Harbor City, and then came here. Sula forgot how many hours he hadn't slept. He only remembered that he hadn't eaten anything except for the last 2 cold dumplings that he had snatched from Lu Jiao. Extreme fatigue, numbness in his fingers caused by the loss of blood, and exhaustion of true qi without energy replenishment. His body began to tremble slightly because of the excessive creatine. But it was not a wonderful sign before the tremor divine art was about to show its power again. Whoosh! The whistling sound broke through the air. Sula frowned and found that the military knife in his right hand stabbed nothing for the first time, because there were no enemies in front of him. In the passage behind him, dozens of elites of the small-eyed troop were lying in a pool of blood. Some pale-faced people were covering the horrible wounds on their necks, and some were constantly letting out low painful screams. The enemies in the H-53 area on the 3rd floor of the battleship had been cleared, but there were still 2 floors above, and countless enemies were waiting for him with live ammunition. It was really tiring. One person couldn't change the world after all. Sula picked up the 2 heavy guns under his feet and hung them on his body. He tiredly lowered his head and continued to move forward. The room not far ahead was the place he had to reach in his plan, so he had to keep moving forward. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.